Chapter 21 of The Head of the House of Coombe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sylviamb. The Head of the House of Coombe by Frances Hodgson Burnett. She saw him again during the following week, and was obliged to tell him that she had not been able to take her charge to Kensington Gardens on the morning that he had appointed, but that, as the girl was fond of the place, and took pleasure in watching the children sailing their boats on the round pond, it would be easy to lead her there. He showed her a photograph of the woman she would find sitting on a particular bench, and he required she should look at it long enough to commit the face to memory. It was that of a quietly elegant woman with gentle eyes. "She will call herself Lady XXIX," he said. "You are to remember that you once taught her little girl in Paris. There must be no haste and no mistakes. It be well for them to meet by accident several times." Later he said to her, "When Lady XXIX invites her to go to her house, you will of course go with her. You will not stay. Lady XXIX will tell you what to do." In words he did not involve himself by giving any hint of his intentions. So far as expression went, he might have had none whatever. Her secret conclusion was that he knew, if he could see the girl under propitious circumstances, at the house of a clever and sympathetic acquaintance, he need have no shadow of a doubt as to the result of his efforts to please her. He knew she was a lonely, romantic creature, who had doubtless read sentimental books and been allured by their heroes. She was, of course, just ripe for young peerings into the land of love-making. His had been no peerings, thought the pale Hirsch sadly. What girl or woman could resist the alluring demand of his drooping eyes, if he chose to allow warmth to fill them? Thinking of it, she almost gnashed her teeth. Did she not see how he would look, bending his high head and murmuring to a woman who shook with joy under his gaze? Had she not seen it in her own forlorn, hopeless dreams? What did it matter if what the world calls disaster befell the girl? Fräulein Hirsch would not have called it disaster. Any woman would have been paid 1,000 times over. His fancy might last a few months. Perhaps he would take her to Berlin, or to some lovely secret spot in the mountains where he could visit her. What heaven! What heaven! She wept, hiding her face on her hot, dry hands. But it would not last long, and he would again think only of the immense work, the august machine, of which he was a mechanical part, and he would be obliged to see and talk to her, Mathilde Hirsch, having forgotten the rest. She could only hold herself decently in check by telling herself again and again that it was only natural that such things should come and go in his magnificent life, and that the sooner it began, the sooner it would end. It was a lovely morning when her pupil walked with her in Kensington Gardens, and quite naturally strolled towards the round pond. Robin was happy because there were flutings of birds in the air, gardeners were stuffing crocuses and hyacinths into the flower-beds. There were little sweet scents floating about, and so it was spring. She pulled a bare-looking branch of a lilac bush towards her, and stooped and kissed the tiny brown buttons upon it, half shyly. "I can't help it when I see the first ones swelling on the twigs. They are working so hard to break out into green," she said. "One loves everything at this time, everything. Look at the children round the pond. That fat little boy in a reefer and brown leather leggings is bursting with joy. Let us go and praise his boat, Fräulein." They went, and Robin praised the boat until its owner was breathless with rapture. Fräulein Hirsch, standing near her, looked furtively at all the benches round the circle, giving no incautiously interested glance to any one of them in particular. Presently, however, she said, "I think that is Lady XXIX sitting on the third bench from here. I said to you that I had heard she was in London. I wonder if her daughter is still in the convent at Tours." When Robin turned, she saw a quiet woman in perfect mourning, recognized Fraulein Hirsch with a bow and a smile which seemed to require nearer approach. "We must go and speak to her," Fraulein Hirsch said. "I know she will wish me to present you. She is fond of young girls, because of Helene." Robin went forward prettily. The woman was gentle-looking and attracting. She had a sweet manner and was very kind to Fraulein Hirsch. She seemed to know her well and to like her. Her daughter, Helene, was still in the convent at Tours, but was expected home very shortly. She would be glad to find that Fraulein Hirsch was in London. "I have turned the entire top story of my big house into a pretty suite for her. She has a fancy for living high above the street," smiled Lady Eitinge indulgently. Perhaps she was a mother person, Robin thought. Both her looks and talk were kind, and she was very nice in her sympathetic interest in the boats and the children's efforts to sail them. "I often bring my book here and forget to read, because I find I am watching them," she said. "They are so eager and so triumphant when a boat gets across the pond." She went away very soon, and Robin watched her out of sight with interest. They saw her again a few days later, and talked a little more. She was not always near the pond when they came, and they naturally did not go there each time they walked together, though Fraulein Hirsch was fond of sitting and watching the children. She had been to take tea with her former employer, she told Robin one day, and she was mildly excited by the preparations for Helene, who had been educated entirely in a French convent and was not like an English girl at all. She had always been very delicate, and the nuns seemed to know how to take care of her and calm her nerves with their quiet ways. "Her mother is rather anxious about her coming to London. She has, of course, no young friends here, and she is so used to the quiet of convent life," the Fraulein explained. "That is why the rooms at the top of the house have been arranged for her. She will hear so little sound. I confess I am anxious about her myself. Lady Eitinge is wondering if she can find a suitable young companion to live in the house with her. She must be a young lady and perfectly educated, and with brightness and charm, not a person like myself, but one who can be treated as an equal and a friend, almost a playmate." "It would be an agreeable position," commented Robin thoughtfully. "Extremely so," answered Fraulein Hirsch. "Helene is a most lovable and affectionate girl, and Lady Eitinge is rich enough to pay a large salary. Helene is her idol. The suite of rooms is perfect. In Germany girls are not spoiled in that way. It is not considered good for them." It was quite natural, since she felt an interest in Helene, that on their next meeting Robin should find pleasure in sitting on the green bench near the girl's mother and hear her speak of her daughter. She was not diffuse or intimate in her manner. Helene first appeared in the talk as a result of a polite inquiry made by Fraulein Hirsch. Robin gathered, as she listened, that this particular girl was a tenderly loved and cared-for creature, and was herself gentle and intelligent and loving. She sounded like the kind of a girl one would be glad to have for a friend. Robin wondered and wondered if she would do. Perhaps out of tactful consideration for the feelings of Fraulein Hirsch, who would not do, because she was neither bright, nor pretty, nor a girl. Lady Eitinge touched but lightly on her idea that she might find a sort of sublimated young companion for her daughter. "It would be difficult to advertise for what one wants," she said. "Yes, to state that a girl must be clever and pretty and graceful and attractive would make it difficult for a modest young lady to write a suitable reply," said Fraulein Hirsch grimly, and both Lady Eitinge and Robin smiled. "Among your own friends," Lady Eitinge said to Robin, a little pathetically in her yearning, "do you know of anyone who might know of anyone who would fit in? Sometimes there are poor little cousins, you know." "Or girls who have an independent spirit and would like to support themselves," said the Fraulein. "There are such girls in these advanced times." "I'm afraid I don't know anyone," answered Robin. Modesty also prevented her from saying that she thought she did. She herself was well educated, she was good-tempered and well-bred, and she had known for some time that she was pretty. "Perhaps Fraulein Hirsch may bring you in to have tea with me some afternoon when you are out," Lady Ittinge said kindly before she left them. "I think you would like to see Helene's rooms. I should be glad to hear what another girl thinks of them." Robin was delighted. Perhaps this was a way opening to her. She talked to Mademoiselle Vallée about it, and so glowed with hope that Mademoiselle's heart was moved. "Do you think I might go?" she said. "Do you think there is any chance that I might be the right person? Am I nice enough, and well enough educated, and are my manners good?" She did not know exactly where Lady Ittinge lived, but believed it was one of those big houses in a certain dignified place they both knew. A corner house, she was sure, because by mere chance she had one day seen Lady Ittinge go into such a house as if it were her own. She did not know the number, but they could ask Fraulein. Fraulein Hirsch was quite ready with detail concerning her former patroness and her daughter. She obviously admired them very much. Her manner held a touch of respectful reverence. She described Helene's disposition and delicate nerves, and the perfection of the nuns' treatment of her. She described the beauty of the interior of the house, its luxury and convenience, and the charms of the suite of apartments prepared for Helene. She thought the number of the house was number 97A. Lady Ittinge was the kindest employer she had ever had. She believed that Miss Gareth Lawless and Helene would be delighted with each other if they met, and her impression was that Lady Ittinge privately hoped they would become friends. Her mild, flat face was so modestly amiable that Mademoiselle Vallée, who always felt her unattractive femininity pathetic, was a little moved by her evident pleasure in having been the humble means of providing Robin with acquaintances of an advantageous kind. No special day had been fixed upon for the visit and the cup of tea. Robin was eager in secret, and hoped Lady Ittinge would not forget to remind them of her invitation. She did not forget. One afternoon — they had not seen her for several days, and had not really expected to meet her, because they took their walk later than usual — they found her just rising from her seat to go home as they appeared. "Our little encounters almost assume the air of appointments," she said. "This is very nice, but I am just going away, I am sorry to say. I wonder," she paused a moment, and then looked at Fraulein Hirsch pleasantly, "I wonder if, in about an hour, you would bring Miss Gareth Lawless to me to have tea, and tell me if she thinks Helene will like her new rooms. You said you would like to see them," brightly, to Robin. "Oh, you're very kind. I should like it so much," was Robin's answer. Fraulein Hirsch was correctly appreciative of the condescension shown to her. Her manner was the perfection of the exact shade of unobtrusive chaperoneship. There was no improper suggestion of a mistaken idea that she was herself a guest, or indeed anything, in fact, but a proper appendage to her charge. Robin had never been fond of Fraulein as she was fond of Mademoiselle and Dowie. Still, she was not only an efficient teacher, but also a good walker, and very fond of long tramps, which Mademoiselle was really not strong enough for, but which Robin's slender young legs rejoiced in. The two never took cabs or buses, but always walked everywhere. They walked on this occasion, and about an hour later arrived at a large corner house in Burford Place. A tall and magnificently built footman opened the door for them, and they were handed into a drawing-room much grander than the one Robin sometimes glanced into as she passed it when she was at home. A quite beautiful tea equipage awaited them on a small table, but Lady Ittinge was not in the room. "What a beautiful house to live in," said Robin. "But do you know the number isn't 97A? I looked as we came in, and it is number 25. "Is it? Oh, I ought to have been more careful," answered Fraulein Hirsch. "It is wrong to be careless, even in small matters." Almost immediately Lady Ittinge came in and greeted them with a sort of gentle delight. She drew Robin down onto a sofa beside her and took her hand and gave it a light pat, which was a caress. "Now, you really are here," she said. "I have been so busy that I have been afraid I should not have time to show you the rooms before it was too late to make a change, if you thought anything might be improved." "Oh, I'm sure nothing can improve them," said Robin, more dewy-eyed than usual, and even a thought breathless, because this was really a sort of adventure, and she longed to ask if, by any chance, she would do. And she was so afraid that she might lose this amazingly good opportunity, merely because she was too young and inexperienced to know how she ought to broach the subject. She had not thought yet of asking Mademoiselle Vallée how it should be done. She was not aware that she looked at Lady Ettinge with a heavenly little unconscious appeal which made her enchanting. Lady Ettinge looked at her quite fixedly for an instant. "What a child you are, and what a colour your cheeks and lips are!" she said. "You are much, much prettier than Helene, my dear." She got up and brought a picture from a side table to show it to her. "I think she is lovely," she said. "Is it because I am her mother?" "Oh, no, not because you're her mother," exclaimed Robin. "She is angelic." She was rather angelic, with her delicate uplifted face and her communion veil framing it mistily. The picture was placed near them, and Robin looked at it many times as they took their tea. To be a companion to a girl with a face like that would be almost too much to ask of one's luck. There was actual yearning in Robin's heart. Suddenly she realized that she had missed something all her life, without knowing that she had missed it. It was the friendly nearness of youth like her own. How she hoped that she might make Lady Ettinge like her! After tea was over, Lady Ettinge spoke pleasantly to Fraulein Hirsch. "I know that you want to register a letter. There is a post-office just around the corner. Would you like to go and register it while I take Miss Gareth Lawless upstairs? You have seen the rooms. You will only be away a few minutes." Fraulein Hirsch was respectfully appreciative again. The letter really was important. It contained money which she sent monthly to her parents. This month she was rather late, and she would be very glad to be allowed to attend to the matter without losing a post. So she went out of the drawing-room and down the stairs, and Robin heard the front door close behind her with a slight thud. She had evidently opened and closed it herself without waiting for the footman. The upper rooms in London houses, even in the large ones, are usually given up to servants' bedrooms, nurseries, and schoolrooms. Stately staircases become narrower as they mount, and the climber gets glimpses of apartments which are frequently bare, whatsoever their use, and, if not grubby in aspect, are dull and uninteresting. But in Lady Ettinge's house it was plain that a good deal had been done. Stairs had been altered and widened. Walls had been given fresh and delicate tints, and one laid one's hand on cream white balustrades and trod on soft carpets. A good architect had taken interest in the problems presented to him, and the result was admirable. Partitions must have been removed to make rooms larger and of better shape. "Nothing could be altered without spoiling it," exclaimed Robin, standing in the middle of a sitting-room all freshness and exquisite colour, the very pictures on the wall being part of the harmony. All that a girl would want or love was there. There was nothing left undone, unremembered. The soft Chesterfield lounge, which was not too big, and was placed near the fire, the writing-table, the books, the piano of satinwood inlaid with garlands, the lamp to sit and read by. "How glad she must be to come back to anyone who loves her so," said Robin. Here was a quilted basket with 3 Persian kittens purring in it, and she knelt and stroked their fluffiness, bending her slim neck and showing how prettily the dark hair grew up from it. It was, perhaps, that at which Lady Ettinge was looking as she stood behind her and watched her. The girl nymph, slenderness, and flexibility of her leaning body was almost touchingly lovely. There were several other rooms, and each one was, in its way, more charming than the other. A library in Dresden blue and white, and with peculiarly pretty windows, struck the last note of cosiness. All the rooms had pretty windows, with rather small square panes enclosed in white frames. It was when she was in this room that Robin took her courage in her hands. She must not let her chance go by. Lady Ittinge was so kind, she wondered if it would seem gauche and too informal to speak now. She stood quite upright and still, though her voice was not quite steady when she began. "Lady Ittinge," she said, "you remember what Fraulein Hirsch said about girls who wish to support themselves? I am one of them. I want very much to earn my own living. I think I am well educated. I have been allowed to read a good deal, and my teachers, Mademoiselle Vallée and Fraulein Hirsch, say I speak and write French and German well for an English girl. If you thought I could be a suitable companion for Miss Ittinge, I should be very happy." How curiously Lady Ittinge watched her as she spoke. She did not look displeased, but there was something in her face which made Robin afraid that she was, perhaps, after all, not the girl who was fortunate enough to quite do. She felt her hopes raised a degree, however, when Lady Ittinge smiled at her. "Do you know, I feel that is very pretty of you," she said. "It quite delights me, as I am an idolizing mother, that my mere talk of Helene should have made you like her well enough to think you might care to live with her. I confess I am modern enough to be pleased with your wishing to earn your own living." "I must," said Robin. "I must. I could not bear not to earn it." She spoke a little suddenly, and a flag of new colour fluttered in her cheek. "When Helene comes, you must meet. If you like each other, as I feel sure you will, and if Mrs. Gareth Lawless does not object, if it remains only a matter of being suitable. You are suitable, my dear, you are suitable." She touched Robin's hand with the light pat which was a caress, and the child was radiant. "Oh, you are kind to me!" The words broke from her involuntarily. "And it is such good fortune. Thank you, Lady Ittinge." The flush of her joy and relief had not died out before the footman, who had opened the door, appeared on the threshold. He was a handsome young fellow whose eyes were not as professionally impassive as his face. A footman had no right to dart a swift side look at one as people did in the street. He did dart such a glance, Robin saw, and she was momentarily struck by its being one of those she sometimes objected to. Otherwise his manner was without flaw. He had only come to announce to his mistress the arrival of a caller. When Lady Ittinge took the card from the salver, her expression changed. She even looked slightly disturbed. "I am sorry," she murmured. "I must see her." Lifting her eyes to Robin, "It is an old friend, merely passing through London. How wicked of me to forget that she wrote to say that she might dash in at any hour." "Please," pled Robin prettily, "I can run away at once. Fraulein Hirsch must have come back. Please." "The lady asked me particularly to say that she has only a few minutes to stay, as she is catching a train," the footman decorously ventured. "If that is the case," Lady Ittinge said, even relievedly, "I will leave you here to look at things until I come back. I really want to talk to you a little more about yourself and Helene. I can't let you go." She looked back from the door before she passed through it. "Amuse yourself, my dear." And then she added hastily to the man, "Have you remembered that there was something wrong with the latch, William? See if it needs a locksmith." "Very good, my lady." She was gone, and Robin stood by the sofa thrilled with happiness and relief. How wonderful it was that, through mere lucky chance, she had gone to watch the children sailing their boats, and that Fraulein Hirsch had seen Lady Ittinge. What good luck, and how grateful she was! The thought which passed through her mind was like a little prayer of thanks. How strange it would be to be really intimate with a girl like herself, or rather like Helene. It made her heart beat to think of it. How wonderful it would be if Helene actually loved her, and she loved Helene. Something sprang out of some depths of her being where past things were hidden. The something was a deadly little memory. Donal. Donal! It would be if she loved Helene, and Helene loved her, as new a revelation as Donal. Oh, she remembered. she heard the footman doing something to the latch of the door, which caused it to make a clicking sound. He was obeying orders and examining it. As she involuntarily glanced at him, he, bending over the door-handle, raised his eyes sideways and glanced at her. It was an inexcusable glance from a domestic, because it was actually as if he were taking the liberty of privately summing her up, taking her points in for his own entertainment. She so resented the unprofessional bad manners of it that she turned away and sauntered into the Dresden blue and white library and sat down with a book. She was quite relieved when, only a few minutes later, he went away, having evidently done what he could. The book she had picked up was a new novel, and opened with an attention-arresting agreeableness, which led her on. In fact, it led her on further and for a longer time than she was aware of. It was her way to become wholly absorbed in books when they allured her. She forgot her surroundings and forgot the passing of time. This was a new book by a strong man with the gift which makes alive people, places, things. The ones whose lives had taken possession of his being in this story were throbbing with vital truth. She read on, because from the first page she knew them as actual, pulsating human creatures. They looked into her face. They laughed. She heard their voices. She cared for every trivial thing that happened to them, to any of them. If one of them picked a flower, she saw how he or she held it, and its scent was in the air. Having been so drawn on into a sort of unconsciousness of all else, it was inevitable that when she suddenly became aware that she did not see her page quite clearly, she should withdraw her eyes from her page and look about her. As she did so, she started from her comfortable chair in amazement and some alarm. The room had become so much darker that it must be getting late. How careless and silly she had been! Where was Fräulein Hirsch? "I am only a strange girl, and Lady Ettenge might so easily have forgotten me," passed through her mind. "Her friend may have stayed, and they may have had so much to talk about that, of course, I was forgotten. But Fräulein Hirsch, how could she?" Then, remembering the subservient humility of the Fräulein's mind, she wondered if it could have been possible that she had been too timid to do more than sit waiting in the hall, perhaps, afraid to allow the footman to disturb Lady Ettenge by asking her where her pupil was. The poor meek silly thing! "I must get away without disturbing anyone," she thought. "I will slip downstairs and snatch Fräulein Hirsch from her seat, and we will go quietly out. I can write a nice note to Lady Ettenge tomorrow and explain. I hope she won't mind having forgotten me. I must make her feel sure that it did not matter in the least. I'll tell her about the book." She replaced the book on the shelf from which she had taken it, and passed through into the delightful sitting-room. The kittens were playing together on the hearth, having deserted their basket. One of them gave a soft, airy pounce after her, and caught at her dress with tiny claws, rolling over and over after his ineffectual snatch. She had not heard the footman close the door when he left the room, but she found he must have done so, as it was now shut. When she turned the handle it did not seem to work well, because the door did not open as it ought to have done. She turned it again and gave it a little pull, but it still remained tightly shut. She turned it again, still with no result, and then she tried the small latch. Perhaps the man had done some blundering thing when he had been examining it. She remembered hearing several clicks. She turned the handle again and again. There was no key in the keyhole, so he could not have bungled with the key. She was quite aghast at the embarrassment of the situation. "How can I get out without disturbing anyone if I cannot open the door?" she said. "How stupid I shall seem to Lady Ettenge. She won't like it. A girl who could forget where she was, and then not be able to open a door, and be obliged to bang until people come." Suddenly she remembered that there had been a door in the bedroom which had seemed to lead out into the hall. She ran into the room in such a hurry that all 3 kittens ran frisking after her. She saw she had not been mistaken. There was a door. She went to it and turned the handle, breathless with excitement and relief. But the handle of that door also would not open it, neither would the latch, and there was no key. "Oh!" she gasped. "Oh!" Then she remembered the electric bell near the fireplace in the sitting-room. There was one by the fireplace here also. No, she would ring the one in the sitting-room. She went to it and pressed the button. She could not hear the ghost of a sound, and one could generally hear something like one. She rang again and waited. The room was getting darker. Oh, how could Fräulein Hirsch? How could she? She waited. She waited. 15 minutes by her little watch. 20 minutes. And in their passing she rang again. She rang the bell in the library, the one in the bedroom, even the one in the bathroom, lest some might be out of order. She slowly ceased to be embarrassed and self-reproachful, and began to feel afraid, though she did not know quite what she was afraid of. She went to one of the windows to look at her watch again in the vanishing light, and saw that she had been ringing the bells for an hour. She automatically put up a hand and leaned against the white frame of one of the decorative small panes of glass. As she touched it, she vaguely realized that it was of such a solidity that it felt not like wood, but iron. She drew her hand away quickly, feeling a sudden sweep of unexplainable fear. Yes, it was fear, and why should she so suddenly feel it? She went back to the door and tried again to open it, as ineffectively as before. Then she began to feel a little cold and sick. She returned to the Chesterfield and sat down on it helplessly. "It seems as if I had been locked in," she broke out in a faint, bewildered wail of a whisper. "Oh, why did they lock the doors?" End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Head of the House of Coombe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sylviamb. The Head of the House of Coombe by Frances Hodgson Burnett. She had known none of the absolute horrors of life which were possible in that underworld which was not likely to touch her own existence in any form. Why, had argued Mademoiselle Vallée, should one fill a white young mind with ugly images which would deface with dark marks and smears, and could only produce unhappiness and perhaps morbid broodings? One does not feel it is wise to give a girl an education in crime. One would not permit her to read the Newgate Calendar for choice. She will be protected by those who love her, and what she must discover, she will discover. That is life. Which is why her first discovery, that neither door could be opened, did not at once fill her with horror. Her first arguments were merely those of a girl who, though her brain was not in active pulp, had still a protected girl's outlook. She had been overwhelmed by a sense of the awkwardness of her position, and by the dread that she would be obliged to disturb and almost inevitably embarrass and annoy Lady Etienne. Of course, there had been some bungling on the part of the impudent footman, perhaps actually at the moment when he had given his sidelong leer at herself instead of properly attending to what he was trying to do. That the bedroom was locked might be the result of a dozen ordinary reasons. The first hint of an abnormality of conditions came after she had rung the bells and had waited in vain for response to her summons. There were servants whose business it was to answer bells at once. If all the bells were out of order, why were they out of order when Helene was to return in a few days and her apartment was supposed to be complete, even to the kittens? Even to the kittens! "It seems as if I had been locked in," she had whispered to the silence of the room. "Why did they lock the doors?" Then she said, and her heart began to thump and race in her side, "It has been done on purpose. They don't intend to let me out, for some horrible reason." Perhaps even her own growing panic was not so appalling as a sudden rushing memory of Lady Etienne, which at this moment overthrew her. Lady Etienne! Lady Ettenge! She saw her gentle face and almost affectionately watching eyes. She heard her voice as she spoke of Helene. She felt the light pat, which was a caress. "No, no!" She gasped it because her breath had almost left her. "No, no, she couldn't. No one could. There's nothing as wicked as that." But even as she cried out, the overthrow was utter, and she threw herself forward on the arm of the couch and sobbed with the passion she had only known on that day long ago when she had crawled into the shrubs and grovelled in the earth. It was the same kind of passion, the shaken and heart-riven woe of a creature who has trusted and hoped joyously and has been forever betrayed. The face and eyes had been so kind, the voice so friendly. Oh, how could even the wickedest girl in the world have doubted their sincerity? Unfortunately, or fortunately, she knew nothing whatever of the mental processes of the wicked girls of the world, which was why she lay broken to pieces, sobbing not at the moment because she was a trapped thing, but because Lady Ettenge had a face in whose gentleness her heart had trusted and rejoiced. When she sat upright again, her own face, as she lifted it, would have struck a perceptive onlooker as being, as it were, the face of another girl. It was tear-stained and wild, but this was not the cause of its change. The soft bird eyes were different, suddenly amazingly older than they had been when she had believed in Helene. She had no experience which could reveal to her in a moment the monstrousness of her danger, but all she had ever read, or vaguely gathered, of lawbreakers and marauders of society collected itself into an advancing tidal wave of horror. She rose and went to the window and tried to open it, but it was not intended to open. The decorative panes were of small size and of thick glass. Her first startled impression that the white framework seemed to be a painted metal was apparently founded on fact. A strong person might have bent it with a hammer, but he could not have broken it. She examined the windows in the other rooms, and they were of the same structure. "They are made like that," she said to herself stonily, "to prevent people from getting out." She stood at the front one and looked down into the broad, stately place. It was a long way to look down, and even if the window could be opened, one's voice would not be heard. The street lamps were lighted, and a few people were to be seen walking past unhurriedly. "In the big house almost opposite they are going to give a party. There's a red carpet rolled out. Carriages are beginning to drive up, and here on the top floor there is a girl locked up, and they don't know." She said it aloud, and her voice sounded as though it were not her own. It was a dreadful voice, and as she heard it, panic seized her. Nobody knew. Nobody. Her mother never either knew or cared where she was, but Dowie and Mademoiselle always knew. They would be terrified. Fraulein Hirsch had perhaps been told that her pupil had taken a cab and gone home, and she would return to her lodgings thinking she was safe. Then, only at this moment, and with a suddenness which produced a sense of shock, she recalled that it was Fraulein Hirsch who had presented her to Lady Ettenge. Fraulein Hirsch herself. It was she who had said she had been in her employ and had taught Helene. Helene! It was she who had related anecdotes about the convent at Tours and the nuns who were so wise and kind. Robin's hand went up to her forehead with a panic-stricken gesture. Fraulein Hirsch has made an excuse for leaving her with Lady Ettenge, to be brought up to the top of the house quite alone and locked in. Fraulein Hirsch had known. And there came back to her the memory of the furtive eyes whose sly, adoring side-looks at Count von Hillern had always, though she had tried not to feel it, been somehow glances she had disliked. Yes, disliked. It was here, by the thread of Fraulein Hirsch, that Count von Hillern was drawn into her mind. Once there, it was as if he stood near her, quite close, looking down under his heavy drooping lids with stealthy, plunging eyes. It had always been when Fraulein Hirsch had walked with her that they had met him, almost as if by arrangement. There were only two people in the world who might, because she herself had so hated them, dislike and choose in some way to punish her. One was Count von Hillern, the other was Lord Coombe. Lord Coombe she knew was bad, vicious, did the things people only hinted at without speaking of them plainly. A sense of instinctive revolt in the strength of her antipathy to von Hillern made her feel that he must be of the same order. If either of them came into this room now and locked the door behind him, I could not get out. She heard herself say it aloud in the strange girl's dreadful voice, as she had heard herself speak of the party in the big house opposite. She put her soft, slim hand up to her soft, slim throat. I could not get out, she repeated. She ran to the door and began to beat on its panels. By this time she knew it would be no use, and yet she beat with her hands until they were bruised, and then she snatched up a book and beat with that. She thought she must have been beating half an hour when she realized that someone was standing outside in the corridor, and the someone said, in a voice she recognized as belonging to the leering footman, "Miss will keep still, miss. You can't hammer it down, and no one's going to bother taking any notice." And then his footsteps retired down the stairs. She involuntarily clenched her hurt hands, and the shuddering began again, though she stood in the middle of the room with a rigid body and her head thrown fiercely back. If there are people in the world as hideous, as monstrous as this, let them kill me if they want to. I would rather be killed than live. They would have to kill me. And she said it in a frenzy of defiance of all mad and base things on earth. Her peril seemed to force her thought to delve into unknown dark places in her memory, and dig up horrors she had forgotten, newspaper stories of crime, old melodramas and mystery romances in which people disappeared and were long afterwards found buried under floors or in cellars. It was said that the Burford Place houses, which were old ones, had enormous cellars under them. Perhaps other girls have disappeared and are now buried in the cellars, she thought, and the dreadful young voice added aloud, because they would have to kill me. One of the Persian kittens curled up in the basket wakened because he heard it, and stretched a sleepy paw and mewed at her. Coombe House was one of the old ones, wearing somewhat the aspect of a stately barrack, with a fine entrance. Its court was enclosed at the front by a stone wall, outside which passing London roared in low tumult. The court was surrounded by a belt of shrubs strong enough to defy the rain of soot which fell quietly upon them day and night. The streets were already lighted for the evening when Mademoiselle Vallée presented herself at the massive front door and asked for Lord Coombe. The expression of her face, and a certain intensity of manner, caused the serious-looking head servant, who wore no livery, to come forward instead of leaving her to the footman. "His lordship is engaged with a business person and must not be disturbed," he said. "He is also going out." "He will see me," replied Mademoiselle Vallée. "If you give him this card, he will see me." She was a plainly dressed woman, but she had a manner which removed her entirely from the class of those who merely came to importune. There was absolute certainty in the eyes she fixed with steadiness on the man's face. He took her card, though he hesitated. "If he does not see me," she added, "he will be very much displeased." "Will you come in, ma'am, and take a seat for a moment?" he ventured. "I will inquire." The Great Hall was one of London's most celebrated. A magnificent staircase swept up from it to landings whose walls were hung with tapestries the world knew. In a gilded chair, like a throne, Mademoiselle Vallée sat and waited. But she did not wait long. The serious-looking man without livery returned almost immediately. He led Mademoiselle into a room like a sort of study or apartment given up to business matters. Mademoiselle Vallée had never seen Lord Coombe's ceremonial evening effect more flawless. Tall, thin, and finely straight, he waited in the centre of the room. He was evidently on the point of going out, and the light-textured, satin-lined overcoat he had already thrown on revealed, through a suggestion of being winged, that he wore in his lapel a delicately fresh, cream-coloured carnation. A respectable, middle-class-looking man, with a steady, blunt-featured face, had been talking to him and stepped quietly aside as Mademoiselle entered. There seemed to be no question of his leaving the room. Coombe met his visitor halfway. "Something has alarmed you very much?" he said. "Robin went out with Fraulein Hirsch this afternoon," she said quickly. "They went to Kensington Gardens. They have not come back, and it is 9 o'clock. They are always at home by 6. "Will you sit down?" he said. The man with the steady face was listening intently, and she realized he was doing so, and that, somehow, it was well that he should. "I do not think there is time for anyone to sit down," she said, speaking more quickly than before. "It is not only that she has not come back. Fraulein Hirsch has presented her to one of her old employers, a Lady Etienne. Robin was delighted with her. She has a daughter who is in France." "Marguerite, staying with her aunt in Paris," suddenly put in the voice of the blunt-featured man from his side of the room. "Helene at a convent in Tours," corrected Mademoiselle, turning a paling countenance towards him, and then upon Coombe. "Lady Etienne spoke of wanting to engage some nice girl as a companion to her daughter, who is coming home. Robin thought she might have the good fortune to please her. She was to go to Lady Etienne's house to tea since afternoon, and be shown the rooms prepared for Helene. She thought the mother charming." "Did she mention the address?" Coombe asked at once. "The house was in Burford Place, a large house at a corner. She chanced to see Lady Etienne go into it one day, or we should not have known. She did not notice the number. Fraulein Hirsch thought it was 97A. I have looked through the Blue Book, Lord Coombe, through the Peerage, through the Directory. There is no Lady Etienne, and there is no 97A in Burford Place. That is why I came here." The man who had stood aside stepped forward again. It was as if he answered some sign, though Lord Coombe at the moment crossed the hearth and rang the bell. "Scotland Yard knows that, ma'am," said the man. "We've had our eyes on that house for 2 weeks, and this kind of thing is what we want." "The double broom," was Coombe's order to the servant who answered his ring. Then he came back to Mademoiselle. "Mr. Barkstow is a detective," he said. "Among the other things he has done for me, he has for some time kept a casual eye on Robin. She is too lovely a child and too friendless to be quite safe. There are blackguards who know when a girl has not the usual family protection. He came here to tell me that she had been seen sitting in Kensington Gardens with a woman Scotland Yard has reason to suspect." "A black 'un," said Barkstow savagely, "if she's the one we think she is. A black, poisonous, sly one with a face that no girl could suspect." Coombe's still countenance was so deadly, in the slow lividness which Mademoiselle saw began to manifest itself, that she caught his sleeve with a shaking hand. "She is nothing but a baby," she said. "She doesn't know what a baby she is. I can see her eyes frantic with terror. She'd go mad." "Good God!" he said, in a voice so low it scarcely was audible. He almost dragged her out of the room, though, as they passed through the hall, the servants only saw that he had given the lady his arm, and 2 of the younger footmen exchanged glances with each other, which referred solely to the inimitableness of the cut of his evening overcoat. When they entered the carriage, Barkstow entered with them, and Mademoiselle Valley leaned forward with her elbows on her knees and her face clutched in her hands. She was trying to shut out from her mental vision a memory of Robin's eyes. If Fraulein Hirsch is not true," she broke out at once, "Count von Hillern is concerned. It has come upon me like a flash. Why did I not see it before?" The party at the big house, where the red carpet was rolled across the pavement, was at full height when they drove into the place. Their brougham did not stop at the corner, but at the end of the line of waiting carriages. Coombe got out and looked up and down the thoroughfare. "It must be done quietly. There must be no scandal," he said. "The policeman on the beat is an enormous fellow. You will attend him, Barkstow." And Barkstow nodded and strolled away. Coombe walked up the place and down on the opposite side until he was within a few yards of the corner house. When he reached this point he suddenly quickened his footsteps because he saw that someone else was approaching it with an air of intention. It was a man, not quite as tall as himself, but of heavier build and with square-held shoulders. As the man set his foot upon the step, Coombe touched him on the arm and said something in German. The man started angrily, and then suddenly stood quite still and erect. "It will be better for us to walk up the place together," Lord Coombe said, with perfect politeness. If he could have been dashed down upon the pavement and his head hammered in with the handle of a sword, or if he could have been run through furiously again and again, either or both of these things would have been done, but neither was possible. It also was not possible to curse aloud in a fashionable London street. Such curses as one uttered must be held in one's foaming mouth between one's teeth. Count von Hillern knew this better than most men would have known it. Here was one of those English swine with whom Germany would deal in her own way later. They walked back together as if they were acquaintances taking a casual stroll. "There is nothing which would so infuriate your master as a disgraceful scandal," Lord Coombe's hybrid voice suggested undisturbedly. "The high honour of a German officer, the knightly bearing of a wearer of the uniform of the all-highest, that sort of thing, you know. All that sort of thing." Von Hillern ground out some low-spoken and quite awful German words. If he had not been trapped! If he had been in some quiet by-street. "The man walking ahead of us is a detective from Scotland Yard. The particularly heavy and rather martial tread behind us is that of a policeman much more muscular than either of us. There's a ball going on in the large house with the red carpet spread across the pavement. I know the people who are giving it. There are a good many coachmen and footmen about. Most of them would probably recognize me." It became necessary for Count von Hillern actually to wipe away certain flecks of foam from his lips as he ground forth again more varied and awful sentiments in his native tongue. "You are going back to Berlin," said Coombe coldly. "If we English were not such fools you would not be here. You are of course not going into that house." Von Hillern burst into a derisive laugh. "You are going yourself," he said. "You are a worn-out old roue, but you are mad about her yourself in your senile way." "You should respect my age and decrepitude," answered Coombe. "A certain pity for my grey hairs would become your youth. Shall we turn here, or will you return to your hotel by some other way?" He felt as if the man might burst a blood vessel if he were obliged to further restrain himself. Von Hillern wheeled at the corner and confronted him. "There will come a day—" He almost choked. "Der Tag? Naturally." The chill of Comb's voice was a sound to drive this particular man at this particular damnably thwarted moment raving mad, and not to be able to go mad, not to be able. "Swine of a doddering Englishman! Who would envy you, trembling on your lean shanks? Whatsoever you can buy for yourself, I spit on you! Spit!" "Don't," said Coombe. "You're sputtering to such an extent that you really are, you know." Von Hillern whirled round the corner. Coombe, left alone, stood still a moment. "I was in time," he said to himself, feeling somewhat nauseated. "By extraordinary luck, I was in time. In earlier days one would have said something about Providence." And he at once walked back. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Head of the House of Coombe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sylviamb. The Head of the House of Coombe by Frances Hodgson Burnett. It was not utterly dark in the room, though Robin, after passing her hands carefully over the walls, had found no electric buttons within reach, nor any signs of candles or matches elsewhere. The night sky was clear and brilliant with many stars, and this gave her an unshadowed and lighted space to look at. She went to the window and sat down on the floor, huddled against the wall with her hands clasped around her knees, looking up. She did this in the effort to hold in check a rising tide of frenzy which threatened her. Perhaps if she could fix her eyes on the vault full of stars, she could keep herself from going out of her mind. Though perhaps it would be better if she did go out of her mind, she found herself thinking a few seconds later. After her first entire acceptance of the hideous thing which had happened to her, she had passed through nerve-breaking phases of terror-stricken imaginings. The old story of the drowning man, across whose brain rush all the images of life, came back to her. She did not know where or when or how she had ever heard or read of the ghastly incidents which came trooping up to her and staring at her with dead or mad eyes and awful faces. Perhaps they were old nightmares. Perhaps a kind of delirium had seized her. She tried to stop their coming by saying over and over again the prayers Dowie had taught her when she was a child. And then she thought, with a sob which choked her, that perhaps they were only prayers for a safe little creature kneeling by a white bed, and did not apply to a girl locked up in a top room which nobody knew about. Only when she thought of Mademoiselle Vallée and Dowie looking for her, with all London spread out before their helplessness, did she cry. After that the tears seemed impossible. The images trooped by too close to her, the passion hidden within her being, which had broken out when she tore the earth under the shrubbery, and which, with torture staring her in the face, had leapt in the child's soul and body and made her defy Andrews with shrieks, leapt up within her now. She became a young fury to whom a mad fight with monstrous death was nothing. She told herself that she was strong for a girl, that she could tear with her nails, she could clench her teeth in the flesh, she could shriek, she could battle like a young madwoman so that they would be forced to kill her. This was one of the images which rose up before her again and yet again, a hideous, hideous thing which would not remain away. She had not had any food since the afternoon cup of tea, and she began to feel the need of it. If she became faint... She lifted her face desperately as she said it, and saw the immense blue darkness, powdered with millions of stars, and curving over her, as it curved over the hideous house and all the rest of the world. How high, how immense, how fathomlessly still it was, how it seemed as if there could be nothing else, that nothing else could be real. Her hands were clenched together hard and fiercely as she scrambled to her knees and uttered a prayer, not a child's, rather the cry of a young fury making a demand. "Perhaps a girl is nothing," she cried. "A girl locked up in a room, but perhaps she is something. She may be real, too. Save me, save me. But if you won't save me, let me be killed." She knelt silent after it for a few moments, and then she sank down and lay on the floor with her face on her arm. How it was possible that even young and worn out as she was, such peace as sleep could overcome her at such a time, one cannot say. But in the midst of her torment she was asleep. But it was not for long. She wakened with a start and sprang to her feet, shivering. The carriages were still coming and going with guests for the big house opposite. It could not be late, though she seemed to have been in the place for years, long enough to feel that it was the hideous centre of the whole earth, and all sane and honest memories were a dream. She thought she would begin to walk up and down the room, but a sound she heard at this very instant made her stand stock still. She had known there would be a sound at last. She had waited for it all the time. She had known, of course, that it would come, but she had not even tried to guess whether she would hear it early or late. It would be the sound of the turning of the handle of the locked door. It had come. There it was, The click of the lock first, and then the creak of the turned handle. She went to the window again and stood with her back against it so that her body was outlined against the faint light. Would the person come in the dark, or would he carry a light? Something began to whirl in her brain. What was the low, pumping thump she seemed to hear and feel at the same time? It was the awful thumping of her heart. The door opened, not stealthily, but quite in the ordinary way. The person who came in did not move stealthily either. He came in as though he were making an evening call. How tall and straight his body was, with a devilish elegance of line against the background of light in the hall. She thought she saw a white flower on his lapel as his overcoat fell back. The leering footman had opened the door for him. "Turn on the lights." A voice she knew gave the order. The leering footman obeyed, touching a spot high on the wall. She had vaguely and sickeningly felt almost sure that it would be either Count von Hillern or Lord Coombe, and it was not Count von Hillern. The cold, wicked face, the ironic eyes which made her creep, the absurd, elderly perfection of dress, even the flawless flower made her flash quite with repulsion. If Satan came into the room, he might look like that and make one's revolting being quite so. "I thought it might be you," the strange girl's voice said to him aloud. "Robin," he said. He was moving towards her, and as she threw out her madly clenched little hands, he stopped and drew back. "Why did you think I might come?" "Because you are the kind of man who would do the things only devils would do. I have hated you since I was a baby. Come and kill me if you like. Call the footman back to help you if you like. I can't get away. Kill me, kill me, kill me." She was lost in her frenzy and looked as if she were mad. One moment he hesitated, and then he pointed politely to the sofa. "Go and sit down, please," he suggested. It was no more than a courteous suggestion. "I shall remain here. I have no desire to approach you, if you'll pardon my saying so." But she would not leave the window. "It is natural that you should be overwrought," he said. "It's a damnable thing. You are too young to know the worst of it." "You are the worst of it," she cried. "You!" "No." As the chill of his even voice struck her, she wondered if he were really human. "Von Hillern would have been the worst of it. I stopped him at the front door and knew how to send him away. Now listen, my good child. Hate me as ferociously as you like. That is a detail. You are in the house of a woman whose name stands for shame and infamy and crime." "What are you doing in it?" she cried again. "In a place where girls are trapped and locked up in top rooms, to be killed." "I came to take you away. I wish to do it quietly. It would be rather horrible if the public discovered that you had spent some hours here. If I had not slipped in when they were expecting von Hillern, and if the servants were not accustomed to the quiet entrance of well-dressed men, I could not have got in without an open row and the calling of the policeman, which I wished to avoid. Also, the woman downstairs knows me and realized that I was not lying when I said the house was surrounded, and she was on the point of being run in. She is a woman of broad experience, and at once knew that she might as well keep quiet." Despite his cold eyes and the bad smile she hated, despite his almost dandified, meticulous attire and the festal note of his white flower, which she hated with the rest, he was, perhaps, not lying to her. Perhaps for the sake of her mother he had chosen to save her, and, being the man he was, he had been able to make use of his past experiences. She began to creep away from the window, and she felt her legs all at once shaking under her. By the time she reached the Chesterfield sofa, she fell down by it and began to cry. A sort of hysteria seized her, and she shook from head to foot and clutched at the upholstery with weak hands which clawed. She was indeed an awful, piteous sight. He was perhaps not lying, but she was afraid of him yet. "I told the men who are waiting outside that if I did not bring you out in half an hour, they were to break into the house. I do not wish them to break in. We have not any time to spare. What you are doing is quite natural, but you must try and get up." He stood by her and said this looking down at her slender wrung body and lovely grovelling head. He took a flask out of his overcoat pocket, and it was a gem of goldsmith's art. He poured some wine into its cup and bent forward to hold it out to her. "Drink this and try to stand on your feet," he said. He knew better than to try to help her rise, to touch her in any way. Seen to what the past hours had reduced her, he knew better. There was mad fear in her eyes when she lifted her head and threw out her hand again. "No, no!" she cried out. "No, I will drink nothing." He understood at once and threw the wine into the grate. "I see," he said. "You might think it might be drugged. You were right. It might be. I ought to have thought of that." He returned the flask to his pocket. "Listen again. You must. The time will soon be up, and we must not let those fellows break in and make a row that will collect a crowd. We must go at once. Mademoiselle Vallée is waiting for you in my carriage outside. You will not be afraid to drink wine she gives you." "Mademoiselle?" she stammered. "Yes, in my carriage, which is not 50 yards from the house. Can you stand on your feet?" She got up and stood, but she was still shuddering all over. "Can you walk downstairs? If you cannot, will you let me carry you? I am strong enough, in spite of my years." "I can walk," she whispered. "Will you take my arm?" She looked at him for a moment with awful, broken, spirited eyes. "Yes, I will take your arm." He offered it to her with rigid punctiliousness of manner. He did not even look at her. He led her out of the room and down the 3 flights of stairs. As they passed by the open drawing-room door, the lovely woman who had called herself Lady Ettinge stood near it and watched them with eyes no longer gentle. "I have something to say to you, madam," he said. "When I place this young lady in the hands of her governess, I will come back and say it." "Is her governess Fraulein Hirsch?" asked the woman lightly. "No. She is doubtless on her way back to Berlin, and von Hillern will follow her." There was only the first-floor flight of stairs now. Robin could scarcely see her way, but Lord Coombe held her up firmly, and in a few moments more the leering footman, grown pale, opened the large door. They crossed the pavement to the carriage, and she was helped in and fell almost insensible across Mademoiselle Vallée's lap, and was caught in a strong arm which shook as she did. "Ma chérie," she heard. "Oh, good God! Oh, the good, good God! And Lord Coombe, Lord Coombe!" Coombe had gone back to the house. 4 men returned with him, 2 in plain clothes and 2 heavily built policemen. They remained below, but Coombe went up the staircase with the swift lightness of a man of 30. He merely stood upon the threshold of the drawing-room. This was what he said, and his face was entirely white, his eyes appalling. "My coming back to speak to you is superfluous, and the result of pure fury. I allow it to myself as mere shameless indulgence. More is known against you than this, things which have gone further and fared worse. You are not young, and you are facing years of life in prison. Your head will be shaved, your hands worn and blackened, and your nails broken with the picking of oakum. You will writhe in hopeless degradation until you are done for. You will have time in the night blackness of your cell to remember, to see faces, to hear cries. Women such as you should learn what hell on earth means. You will learn." When he ended, the woman hung with her back to the wall she had staggered against, her mouth opening and shutting helplessly, but letting forth no sound. He took out an exquisitely fresh handkerchief and touched his forehead because it was damp. His eyes were still appalling, but his voice suddenly dropped and changed. "I have allowed myself to feel like a madman," he said. "It has been a rich experience, good for such a soul as I own." He went downstairs and walked home, because his carriage had taken Robin and Mademoiselle back to the slice of a house. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Head of the House of Coombe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sylviamb. The Head of the House of Coombe by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Von Hillern made no further calls on Mrs. Gareth Lawless. His return to Berlin was immediate, and Fräulein Hirsch came no more to give lessons in German. Later, Coombe learned from the man with the steady, blunt-featured face that she had crossed the Channel on a night boat not many hours after Von Hillern had walked away from Burford Place. The exact truth was that she had been miserably prowling about the adjacent streets, held in the neighbourhood by some self-torturing morbidness, half-thwarted, helpless passion, half-triumphing hatred of the young thing she had betrayed. Up and down the streets she had gone, round and round, wringing her lean fingers together and tasting on her lips the salt of tears which rolled down her cheeks, tears of torment and rage. There was the bitterness of death in what, by a mere trick of chance, came about. As she turned a corner, telling herself for the 100th time that she must go home, she found herself face to face with a splendid figure swinging furiously along. She staggered at the sight of the tigerish rage in the white face she recognized with a gasp. It was enough merely to behold it. He had met with some disastrous humiliation. As for him, the direct intervention of that heaven whose special care he was had sent him a woman to punish, which so far was at least one thing arranged as it should be. He knew so well how he could punish her with his mere contempt and displeasure, as he could lash a spaniel crawling at his feet. He need not deign to tell her what had happened, and he did not. He merely drew back and stood in stiff magnificence looking down at her. "It is through some folly of yours," he dropped in a voice of vitriol. "Women are always foolish. They cannot hold their tongues or think clearly. Return to Berlin at once. You are not of those whose conduct I can commend to be trusted in the future." He was gone before she could have spoken, even if she had dared. Sobbing gasps caught her breath as she stood and watched him striding piteously and superbly away, with what seemed to her abject soul the swing and tread of a martial god. Her streaming tears tasted salt indeed. She might never see him again, even from a distance. She would be disgraced and flung aside as a blundering woman. She had obeyed his every word and done her straining best as she had licked the dust at his feet. But he would never cast a glance at her in the future or utter to her the remotest word of his high commands. She so reeled as she went her wretched way that a good-natured policeman said to her as he passed, "Steady on, my girl. Best get home and go to bed." To Mrs. Gareth Lawless it was stated by Coombe that Fräulein Hirsch had been called back to Germany by family complications. That august order should recall Count von Hillern was easily understood. Such magnificent persons never shone upon society for any length of time. That Feather had been making a country home visit when her daughter had faced tragedy was considered by Lord Coombe as a fortunate thing. "We will not alarm Mrs. Gareth Lawless by telling her what has occurred," he said to Mademoiselle Vallée. "What we most desire is that no one shall suspect that the hideous thing took place. A person who was forgetful or careless might unintentionally let some word escape which—" What he meant, and what Mademoiselle Vallée knew he meant, also what he knew she knew he meant, was that a woman who was a heartless fool without sympathy or perception would not have the delicacy to feel that the girl must be shielded, and might actually see a sort of ghastly joke in a story of Mademoiselle Valley's sacrosanct charge simply walking out of her enshrining arms into such a galère as the most rackety and adventurous of pupils could scarcely have been led into. Such a point of view would have been quite possible for Feather, even probable, in the slightly spiteful attitude of her light mind. "She was away from home. Only you and I and Dowie know," answered Mademoiselle. "Let us remain the only persons who know," said Coombe. "Robin will say nothing." They both knew that. She had been feverish and ill for several days, and Dowie had kept her in bed saying that she had caught cold. Neither of the two women had felt it possible to talk to her. She had lain staring with a deadly quite fixedness straight before her, saying next to nothing. Now and then she shuddered, and once she broke into a mad, heartbroken fit of crying, which she seemed unable to control. "Everything is changed," she said to Dowie and Mademoiselle, who sat on either side of her bed, sometimes pressing her head down onto a kind shoulder, sometimes holding her hand and patting it. "I shall be afraid of everybody forever. People who have sweet faces and kind voices will make me shake all over. Oh, she seems so kind, so kind." It was Dowie, whose warm shoulder her face hidden on this time, and Dowie was choked with sobs she dared not let loose. She could only squeeze hard and kiss the silk curls all in a heap. Poor tumbled curls, no longer a child's. "Ay, my lamb," she managed to say, "Dowie's poor pet lamb. It's the knowing, the kind eyes, kind ones," she broke off, panting. It's the knowing I didn't know before. I knew nothing. Now it's all over. I'm afraid of all the world." "Not all, chérie," breathed Mademoiselle. She sat upright against her pillows. The mirror on a dressing-table reflected her image, her blooming, tear-wet youth framed in the wonderful hair, falling a shadow about her. She stared at the reflection, hard and questioningly. "I suppose," her voice was pathos itself in its helplessness, "it is because what you once told me about being pretty is true. A girl who looks like that," pointing her finger at the glass, "need not think she can earn her own living. I loathe it." In fierce resentment at some bitter injustice. "It is like being a person under a curse." At this Dowie broke down openly and let her tears run fast. "No, no, you mustn't say it or think it, my dearie," she wept. "It might call down a blight on it. You, a young thing like a garden flower, and someone somewhere, God bless him, that some day'll glory in it, and you'll glory too. Somewhere he is, somewhere." "Let none of them look at me," cried Robin. "I loathe them too. I hate everything and everybody. But you two, just you two." Mademoiselle took her in her arms this time when she sobbed again. Mademoiselle knew how at this hour it seemed to her that all her world was laid bare for evermore. When the worst of the weeping was over and she lay quiet, but for the deep catching breaths which lifted her breast in slow, childish shudders at intervals, she held Mademoiselle Valley's hand and looked at her with a faint, wry smile. "You were too kind to tell me what a stupid little fool I was when I talked to you about taking the place in an office," she said. "I know now that you would not have allowed me to do the things I was so sure I could do. It was only my ignorance and conceit. I can't answer advertisements. Any bad person can say what they choose in an advertisement. If that woman had advertised, she would have described Helene. And there was no Helene." One of the shuddering catches of her breath broke in here. After it, she said, with a pitiful girlishness of regret, I could see Helene. I have known so few people well enough to love them. No girls at all. I thought, perhaps, we should begin to love each other. I can't bear to think of that she never was alive at all. It leaves a sort of empty place." When she had sufficiently recovered herself to be up again, Mademoiselle Vallée said to her that she wished her to express her gratitude to Lord Coombe. "I will if you wish it," she answered. "Don't you feel that it is proper that you should do it? Do you not wish it yourself?" inquired Mademoiselle. Robin looked down at the carpet for some seconds. "I know," she at last admitted, "that it is proper, but I don't wish to do it." "No?" said Mademoiselle Vallée. Robin raised her eyes from the carpet and fixed them on her. "It is because of reasons," she said. "It is part of the horror I want to forget. Even you mayn't know what it has done to me. Perhaps I am turning into a girl with a bad mind. Bad thoughts keep swooping down on me like great black ravens. Lord Coombe saved me, but I think hideous things about him. I heard Andrew say he was bad when I was too little to know what it meant. Now I know. I remember that he knew because he chose to know, of his own free will. He knew that woman and she knew him. How did he know her?" She took a forward step, which brought her nearer to Mademoiselle. "I never told you, but I will tell you now," she confessed. "When the door opened and I saw him standing against the light, I did not think he had come to save me." "Mon Dieu!" breathed Mademoiselle in soft horror. "He knows I am pretty. He is an old man, but he knows. Fraulein Hirsch once made me feel actually sick by telling me in her meek, sly, careful way that he liked beautiful girls, and the people said he wanted a young wife and had his eye on me. I was rude to her because it made me so furious. How did he know that woman so well? You see how bad I have been made. He knows nearly all Europe. He has seen the dark corners as well as the bright places. Perhaps he has saved other girls from her. He brought her to punishment, and was able to do it because he has been on her track for some time. You are not bad, but unjust. You have had too great a shock to be able to reason sanely just yet." "I think he will always make me creep a little," said Robin, "but I will say anything you think I ought to say." On an occasion when Feather had gone again to make a visit in the country, Mademoiselle came into the sitting-room with the round window in which plants grew, and Coombe followed her. Robin looked up from her book with a little start, and then stood up. "I have told Lord Coombe that I wish you to thank him," Mademoiselle Vallée said. "I came on my own part to tell you that any expression of gratitude is entirely unnecessary," said Coombe. "I must be grateful. I am grateful." Robin's colour slowly faded as she said it. This was the first time she had seen him since he had supported her down the staircase which mounted to a place of hell. "There is nothing to which I should object so much as being regarded as a benefactor," he answered definitely, but with entire lack of warmth. "The role does not suit me. Being an extremely bad man," he said it as one who speaks wholly without prejudice, "my experience is wide. I chance to know things. The woman who called herself Lady Ettinge is of a class which does not count me among its clients. I had put certain authorities on her track, which was how I discovered your whereabouts when Mademoiselle Vallée told me that you had gone to take tea with her. Mere chance, you see. Don't be grateful to me, I beg of you, but to Mademoiselle Vallée." "Why," faltered Robin, vaguely repelled as much as ever, "did it matter to you?" "Because," he answered, oh, the cold inhumanness of his grey eye, "you happen to live in this house." "I thought that was perhaps the reason," she said, and she felt that he made her creep even a shade more. "I beg your pardon," she added, suddenly remembering. "Please sit down." "Thank you," as he sat. "I will because I have something more to say to you." Robin and Mademoiselle seated themselves also, and listened. "There are many hideous aspects of existence which are not considered necessary portions of a girl's education," he began. "They ought to be," put in Robin, and her voice was as hard as it was young. It was a long and penetrating look he gave her. "I am not an instructor of youth. I have not been called upon to decide. I do not feel it my duty to go even now into detail." "You need not," broke in the hard young voice. "I know everything in the world. I'm black with knowing." "Mademoiselle will discuss that point with you. What you have, unfortunately, been forced to learn is that it is not safe for a girl, even a girl without beauty, to act independently of older people, unless she has found out how to guard herself against devils." The words broke from him sharply, with a sudden incongruous hint of ferocity which was almost startling. "You have been frightened," he said next, "and you have discovered that there are devils, but you have not sufficient experience to guard yourself against them." "I have been so frightened that I shall be a coward all my life. I shall be afraid of every face I see. The more to be trusted they look, the more I shall fear them. I hate everyone in the world." Her quite wonderful eyes, so they struck Lord Coombe, flamed with a child's outraged anguish. A thunder shower of tears broke and rushed down her cheeks, and he rose and, walking quietly to the window full of flowers, stood with his back to her for a few moments. She neither cared nor knew whether it was because her hysteric emotion bored or annoyed him, or because he had the taste to realize that she would not wish to be looked at. Unhappy youth can feel no law but its own. But all was over during the few moments, and he turned and walked back to his chair. "You want very much to do some work which will ensure your entire independence, to take some situation which will support you without aid from others. You are not yet prepared to go out and take the first place which offers. You have been, as you say, too hideously frightened, and you know there are dangers in wandering about unguided. Mademoiselle Vallée," turning his head, "perhaps you will tell her what you know of the Duchess of Dart." Upon which Mademoiselle Vallée took hold of her hand and entered into a careful explanation. "She is a great personage of whom there can be no doubt. She was a lady of the court. She is of advanced years and an invalid, and has a liking for those who are pretty and young. She desires a companion who is well educated and young and fresh of mind. The companion who had been with her for many years recently died. If you took her place, you would live with her in her town house and go with her to the country after the season. Your salary would be liberal, and no position could be more protected and dignified. I have seen and talked to her Grace myself, and she will allow me to take you to her if you desire to go. Do not permit the fact that she has known me for many years to prejudice you against the proposal," said Coombe. "You might perhaps regard it rather as a sort of guarantee of my conduct in the matter. She knows the worst of me, and still allows me to retain her acquaintance. She was brilliant and full of charm when she was a young woman, and she is even more so now because she is of a rarity. If I were a girl and might earn my living in her service, I should feel that fortune had been good to me. Good." Robin's eyes turned from one of them to the other, from Coombe to Mademoiselle Vallée, and from Mademoiselle to Coombe, pathetically. You see what has been done to me," she said. "A few weeks ago I should have known that God was providing for me, taking care of me, and now I am still afraid. I feel as if she would see that I am not young and fresh any more, but black with evil. I am afraid of her. I am afraid of you," to Coombe, "and of myself." Coombe rose, evidently to go away. "But you are not afraid of Mademoiselle Vallée," he put it to her. "She will provide the necessary references for the Duchess. I will leave her to help you decide." Robin rose also. She wondered if she ought not to hold out her hand. Perhaps he saw her slight movement. He himself made none. "I remember you objected to shaking hands as a child," he said, with an impersonal civil smile, and the easy punctiliousness of his bow made it impossible for her to go further. End of chapter 24.
Chapter 25 of The Head of the House of Coombe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Tim Rowe. The Head of the House of Coombe by Francis Hodgson Burnett. Section 25. Some days before this, the Duchess of Dart had driven out in the morning to make some purchases, and as she had sat in her large landau, she had greatly missed Miss Brent, who had always gone with her when she had made necessary visits to the shops. She was not fond of shopping, and Miss Brent had privately found pleasure in it, which had made her a cheerful companion to the quiet, elderly woman whose life previous to her service with this great lady had been spent in struggles with poverty. The mere incident of entering shops and finding eager salesmen springing forward to meet her with bows and amiable offers of ministration was to the end of her days an almost thrilling thing. The Duchess bought splendidly, though quietly. Knowing always what she wanted, she merely required that it be produced, and after silently examining it, gave orders that it should be sent to her. There was a dignity in her decision which was impressive. She never gave trouble or hesitated. The staffs of employees in the large shops knew and revelled in her, while they figuratively bent the knee. Miss Brent had been a happy, satisfied woman while she had lived. She had died peacefully after a brief and, as it seemed at first, unalarming illness at one of her employer's country houses, to which she had been amiably sent down for a holiday. Every kindness and attention had been bestowed upon her, and only a few moments before she fell into her last sleep, she had been talking pleasantly of her mistress. "She is a very great lady, Miss Hallam," she said to her nurse. "She's the last of her kind, I often think. Very great ladies seem to have gone out, if you know what I mean. They've gone out." The Duchess had in fact said of Brent as she stood a few days later beside her coffin and looked down at her contentedly serene face something not unlike what Brent had said of herself. "You are a good friend, Brent, my dear," she murmured. "I shall always miss you. I am afraid there are no more like you left." She was thinking of her all the morning as she drove slowly to Bond Street and Piccadilly. As she got out of her carriage to go into a shop, she was attracted by some photographs of beauties in a window and paused to glance at them. Many of them were beauties whom she knew, but among them were some of society's latest discoveries. The particular photographs which caught her eye were two which had evidently been purposely placed side by side for an interesting reason. The reason was that the two women, while obviously belonging to periods of some 20 years apart, as the fashion of their dress proved, were in face and form so singularly alike that they bewilderingly suggested that they were the same person. Both were exquisitely nymph-like, fair and large-eyed, and both had the fine light hair which is capable of forming itself into a halo. The Duchess stood and looked at them for the moment, spellbound. She slightly caught her breath. She was borne back so swiftly and so far. Her errand in the next-door shop was forgotten. She went into the one which displayed the photographs. "I wish to look at the two photographs which are so much alike," she said to the man behind the counter. He knew her as most people did and brought forth the photographs at once. "Many people are interested in them, Your Grace," he said. "It was the amazing likeness which made me put them beside each other." "Yes," she answered. "It is almost incredible." She looked up from the beautiful young being dressed in the mode of 20 years past. Was, she corrected herself and paused. The man replied in a somewhat dropped voice. He evidently had his reasons for feeling it discreet to do so. "Yes, was. She died 20 years ago, the young Princess Alix of X," he said. "There was a sad story, Your Grace no doubt remembers. It was a good deal talked about." "Yes," she replied, and said no more, but took up the modern picture. It displayed the same almost floating airiness of type, but in this case the original wore diaphanous wisps of spangled tulle, threatening to take wings and fly away, leaving the girl's slimness of arms and shoulders bereft of any covering whatsoever. "This one is?" she questioned. "Mrs. Gareth Lawless, a widow with a daughter, though she looks in her teens. She's older than the princess was, but she's kept her beauty as ladies know how to in these days. It's wonderful to see them side by side, but it's only a few that saw her highness as she was, the season she came with the prince to visit at Windsor in Queen Victoria's day. Did your grace—" He checked himself, feeling that he was perhaps somewhat exceeding Bond Street limits. "Yes, I saw her," said the Duchess. If these are for sale, I will take them both. I'm selling a good many of them. People buy them because the likeness makes them a sort of curiosity. Mrs. Gareth Lawless is a very modern lady, and she is quite amused." The Duchess took the 2 photographs home with her and looked at them a great deal afterwards as she sat in her winged chair. They were on her table when Coombe came to drink tea with her in the afternoon. When he saw them, he stood still and studied the 2 faces silently for several seconds. "Did you ever see a likeness so wonderful?" he said at last. "Never," she answered, "or an unlikeness. That is the most wonderful of all, the unlikeness. It is the same body inhabited by 2 souls in different spheres." His next words were spoken very slowly. "I should have been sure you would see that," he commented. "I lost my breath for a second when I saw them side by side in the shop window, and the next moment I lost it again because I saw what I speak of, the utter world-wide apartness. It is in their eyes. She touched the silver frame enclosing the young princess. "Was a little saint, a little spirit. There never was a young human thing so transparently pure." The rigid modelling of his face expressed a thing which, himself recognizing its presence, he chose to turn aside as he moved towards the mantel and leaned on it. The same thing caused his voice to sound hoarse and low as he spoke in answer, saying something she had not expected him to say. Its unexpectedness, in fact, produced in her an effect of shock. "And she was the possession of a brute incarnate, mad with unbridled lust and drink, and abnormal furies. She was a child saint and shook with terror before him. He killed her." "I believe he did," she said unsteadily after a breath's space of pause. "Many people believed so, though great effort was made to silence the stories. But there were too many stories, and they were so unspeakable that even those in high places were made furiously indignant. He was not received here at court afterwards. His own emperor could not condone what he did. Public opinion was too strong." "The stories were true," answered the hoarse, low voice. "I myself, by royal command, was a guest at the Schloss in the Bavarian Alps, when it was known that he struck her repeatedly with a dog-whip. She was going to have a child. One night I was wandering in the park in misery, and I heard shrieks which sent me in mad search. I do not know what I should have done if I had succeeded, but I tried to force an entrance into the wing from which the shrieks came. I was met and stopped almost by open violence. The sounds ceased. She died a week later, but the most experienced lying could not hide some things. Even royal menials may have human blood in their veins. It was known that there were hideous marks on her little dead body." We heard," whispered the Duchess. "He killed her, but she would have died of horror if he had not struck her a blow. She began to die from the hour the marriage was forced upon her. I saw that when she was with him at Windsor." "You were in attendance on him," the Duchess said after a little silence. "That was when I first knew you." "Yes." She added the last sentence gravely, and his reply was as grave, though his voice was still hoarse. "You were sublime goodness and wisdom. When a woman, through the sheer quality of her silence, saves a man from slipping over the verge of madness, he does not forget. While I was sane, I dared scarcely utter her name. If I had gone mad, I should have raved as madmen do. For that reason, I was afraid." "I knew. Speech was the greatest danger," she answered him. "She was a princess of a royal house, poor little angel, and she had a husband whose vileness and violence all Europe knew. How dared they give her to him?" "For reasons of their own, and because she was too humbly innocent and obedient to rebel." The Duchess did not ask questions. The sublime goodness of which he had spoken had revealed its perfection through the fact that in the long past days she had neither questioned nor commented. She had given her strong soul's secret support to him, and in his unbearable hours he had known that when he came to her for refuge, while she understood his need to the uttermost, she would speak no word even to himself. But today, though she asked no question, her eyes waited upon him, as it were. This was because she saw that for some unknown reason a heavy veil had rolled back from the past. He had chosen to keep hidden even from himself, as it were, more than from others. "Speech is the most dangerous thing," he said, Only the silence of years piled one upon the other will bury unendurable things. Even thought must be silenced. I have lived a lifetime since." His words began to come very slowly. As she listened, she felt as if he were opening a grave and drawing from its depths long-buried things. "Since the night when I met her alone in a wood in the park of the Schloss, and lost hold of myself, lost it utterly." The Duchess's withered hands caught each other in a clasp which was almost like a passionate exclamation. "There was such a night, and I was young, not an iron-bound vieillard then. When one is young, one's anguish is the deluge which ends the world for ever. I had lain down and risen up and spent every hour in growing torture for months. I had been forced to bind myself down with bands of iron. When I found myself, without warning, face to face with her, alone in the night stillness of the wood, the bands broke. She had dared to creep out in secret to hide herself, and her heartbroken terror in the silence and darkness alone. I knew it without being told. I knew, and I went quite mad for the time. I was only a boy. I threw myself face downward on the earth and sobbed, embracing her young feet." Both of them were silent for a few moments before he went on. "She was not afraid," he said, even with something which was like a curious smile of tender pity at the memory. "Afterwards, when I stood near her, trembling, she even took my hand and held it. Once she kissed it humbly like a little child while her tears rained down. Never before was there anything as innocently heartbreaking. She was so piteously grateful for love of any kind and so heart-wrung by my misery." He paused again and looked down at the carpet, thinking. Then he looked up at her directly. "I need not explain to you. You will know. I was 25. My heart was pounding in my side. My blood thudded through my veins. Every atom of natural, generous manhood in my being was wild with fury at the brutal wrong done her exquisiteness. She was a young novice, fresh from a convent and very pious," the Duchess's quiet voice put in. "You understand," he answered. "She knelt down and prayed for her own soul as well as mine. She thanked God that I was kind and would forgive her and go away and only remember her in my prayers. She believed it was possible. It was not, but I kissed the hem of her white dress and left her standing alone, a little saint in a woodland shrine. That was what I thought deliriously as I staggered off. It was the next night that I heard her shrieks. Then she died." The Duchess knew what else had died. The high adventure of youth and joy of life in him, the brilliant spirit which had been himself and whose utter withdrawal from his being had left him as she had seen him on his return to London in those days which now seemed a memory of a past life in a world which had passed also. He had appeared before her late one afternoon, and she had for a moment been afraid to look at him because she was so struck to the depths of her being by a sense of seeing before her a body which had broken the link, holding it to life, and walked the earth, the crowded streets, the ordinary rooms where people gathered, a dead thing. Even when it moved, it gazed out of dead eyes. And the years had passed, and though they had been friends, he had never spoken until now. "Such a thing must be buried in a tomb covered with a heavy stone and with a seal set upon it. I am unsealing a tomb," he said. Then after a silence he added, "I have, of course, a reason." She bent her head, because she had known this must be the case. "There is a thing I wish you to understand. Every woman could not." "I shall understand." "Because I know you will, I need not enter into exact detail. You will not find what I say abnormal." There had been several pauses during his relation. Once or twice he had stopped in the middle of a sentence, as if for calmer breath or to draw himself back from a past which had suddenly become again a present of torment too great to face with modern steadiness. He took breath, so to speak, in this manner again. "The years pass, the agony of being young passes, one slowly becomes another man," he resumed. "I am another man. I could not be called a creature of sentiment. I have given myself interests in existence, many of them, but the sealed tomb is now under one's feet. Not to allow oneself to acknowledge its existence consciously is one's affair, but the devil of chance sometimes chooses to play tricks. Such a trick was played on me. He glanced down at the two pictures at which she herself was looking with grave eyes. It was the photograph of Feather he took up and set a strange, questioning gaze upon. "When I saw this," he said, "this exquisitely smiling at me under a green tree in a sunny garden, the tomb opened under my feet and I stood on the brink of it. 25 again." "You cannot possibly put it into words," the Duchess said. "You need not, I know," for he had become for the moment almost livid. Even to her, who so well knew him, it was a singular thing to see him hastily set down the picture and touch his forehead with his handkerchief. She knew he was about to tell her his reason for this unsealing of the tomb. When he sat down at her table he did so. He did not use many phrases, but in making clear his reasons he also made clear to her certain facts which most persons would have ironically disbelieved. But no shadow of a doubt passed through her mind, because she had, through a long life, dwelt interestedly on the many variations of human type. She was extraordinarily interested when he ended with the story of Robin. "I do not know exactly why it matters to me. I'm quoting her mother," he explained, "but it happens that I am determined to stand between the child and what would otherwise be the inevitable. It is not that she has the slightest resemblance to anyone, which might awaken memory. It is not that. She and her mother are of totally different types, and her detestation of me is unconquerable. She believes me to be the worst of men. When I entered the room into which the woman had trapped her, she thought I came as one of the creature's damnable clients. You will acknowledge that my position presents difficulties in the way of explanation to a girl, to most adults in fact. Her childish frenzy of desire to support herself arises from her loathing of the position of accepting support from me. I sympathize with her entirely." "Mademoiselle Vallée is an intelligent woman," the Duchess said, as though thinking the matter out. "Send her to me and we will talk the matter over. Then she can bring the child." End of chapter 25.
Chapter 26 of The Head of the House of Coombe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sylviamb. The Head of the House of Coombe by Frances Hodgson Burnett. As a result of this, Her Grace saw Mademoiselle Vallée alone a few mornings later, and talked to her long and quietly. Their comprehension of each other was complete. Before their interview was at an end, the Duchess's interest in the adventure she was about to enter into had become profound. "The sooner she is surrounded by a new atmosphere, the better," was one of the things the Frenchwoman had said. "The prospect of an arrangement so perfect and so secure fills me with the profoundest gratitude. It is absolutely necessary that I return to my parents in Belgium. They are old and failing in health and need me greatly. I have been sad and anxious for months because I felt that it would be wickedness to desert this poor child. I have been torn in two. Now I can be at peace, thank the good God. Bring her to me tomorrow, if possible," the Duchess said when they parted. "I foresee that I may have something to overcome in the fact that I am Lord Coombe's old friend, but I hope to be able to overcome it. She is a baby. She is of great beauty. She has a passionate little soul of which she knows nothing." Mademoiselle Vallée said it with an anxious reflectiveness. "I have been afraid. If I were her mother—" Her eyes sought those of the older woman. "But she has no mother," Her Grace answered. Her own eyes were serious. She knew something of girls, of young things, of the rush and tumult of young life in them and of the outlet it demanded. A baby who was of great beauty and of a passionate soul was no trivial undertaking for a rheumatic old duchess, but "Bring her to me," she said. So was Robin brought to the tall, early Victorian mansion in the belatedly stately square. And the chief thought in her mind was that, though mere good manners demanded under the circumstances that she should come to see the Dowager Duchess of Dart and be seen by her, if she found that she was like Lord Coombe, she would not be able to endure the prospect of a future spent in her service, howsoever desirable such service might outwardly appear.
This desirableness Mademoiselle Vallée had made clear to her. She was to be the companion of a personage of great and mature charm and grace, who desired not mere attendance, but something more, which something included the warmth and fresh brightness of happy youth and bloom. She would do for her employer the things a young relative might do. She would have a suite of rooms of her own, and a freedom as to hours and actions which greater experience on her part would have taught was not the customary portion meted out to a paid companion. But she knew nothing of paid service, and a preliminary talk of Coombe's with Mademoiselle Vallée had warned her against allowing any suspicion that this earning a living had been too obviously ameliorated. Her life is unusual. She herself is unusual in a most dignified and beautiful way. You will, it might almost be said, hold the position of a young lady in waiting, was Mademoiselle's gracefully put explanation. When, after they had been ushered into the room where her Grace sat in her beautiful and mellow corner by the fire, Robin advanced towards the high-backed chair, what the old woman was chiefly conscious of was the eyes, which seemed all lustrous iris. There was uncommon appeal and fear in them. The blackness of their setting of up-curled lashes made them look babyishly wide. "Mademoiselle Vallée has told me of your wish to take a position as companion," the Duchess said, after they were seated. "Oh, I want very much," said Robin, "to support myself, and Mademoiselle thinks I might fill such a place if I am not considered too young." "You are not too young for me. I want something young to come and befriend me. Am I too old for you?" Her smile had been celebrated 50 years earlier, and it had not changed. A smile does not. She was not like Lord Coombe in any degree, however remote. She did not belong to his world, Robin thought. "If I can do well enough the things you require done," she answered, blushing her Jacqueminot rose blush, "I shall be grateful if you will let me try to do them. Mademoiselle will tell you that I have no experience, but that I am one who tries well. Mademoiselle has answered all my questions concerning your qualifications so satisfactorily that I need ask you very few." Such questions as she asked were not of the order Robin had expected. She led her into talk and drew Mademoiselle Vallée into the conversation. It was talk which included personal views of books, old gardens and old houses, people, pictures, and even, lightly, politics. Robin found herself quite incidentally, as it were, reading aloud to her an Italian poem. She ceased to be afraid, and was at ease. She forgot Lord Coombe. The Duchess, listening and watching her, warmed to her task of delicate investigation, and saw reason for anticipating agreeably stimulating things. She was not taking upon herself a merely benevolent duty which might assume weight and become a fatigue. In fact, she might trust Coombe for that. After all, it was he who had virtually educated the child, little as she was aware of this singular fact. It was he who had dragged her forth from her dog-kennel of a top-floor nursery, and, quaintly incongruous as it seemed, had found her a respectable woman for a nurse and an intelligent person for a governess, and companion as if he had been a domesticated middle-class widower with a little girl to play mother to. She saw it in the situation more than others would have seen it, but she saw also the ironic humour of it. Coombe, with the renowned cut of his overcoat, the perfection of his line, and scarcely to be divined suggestions of hue. Coombe! She did not avoid all mention of his name during the interview, but she spoke of him only casually, and though the salary she offered was an excellent one, it was not inordinate. Robin could not feel that she was not being accepted as of the class of young persons who supported themselves self-respectingly, though even the most modest earned income would have represented wealth to her ignorance. Before they parted, she had obtained the position so pleasantly described by Mademoiselle Vallée as being something like that of a young lady in waiting. "But I am really a companion, and I will do everything I can, so that I shall be worth keeping," she thought seriously. She felt that she should want to be kept. If Lord Coombe was a friend of her employer's, it was because the Duchess did not know what others knew, and her house was not his house. and the hideous thing she had secretly loathed would be at an end. She would be supporting herself as decently and honestly as Mademoiselle or Dowie had supported themselves all their lives. With an air of incidentally recalling a fact, the Duchess said, after they had risen to leave her, "Mademoiselle Vallée tells me you have an elderly nurse you are very fond of. She seems to belong to a class of servants almost extinct." "I love her," Robin faltered, because a sudden reminder brought back a pang to her. There was a look in her eyes which faltered also. "She loves me. I don't know how." But there she stopped. Such women are very valuable to those who know the meaning of their type. I myself am always in search of it. My dear Miss Brent was of it, though of a different class. "But most people do not know," said Robin. "It seems old-fashioned to them, and it's beautiful. Dowie is an angel." "I should like to secure your Dowie for my housekeeper and myself." One of the greatest powers of the celebrated smile was its power to convince. "A competent person is needed to take charge of the linen. If we can secure an angel, we shall be fortunate." A day or so later, she said to Coombe, in describing the visit, "The child's face is wonderful. If you could but have seen her eyes when I said it. It is not the mere beauty of size and shape and colour which affect one, it is something else. She is a little flame of feeling." The something else was in the sound of her voice as she answered, "She will be in the same house with me. Sometimes perhaps I may see her and talk to her. Oh, how grateful I am!" She might even see and talk to her as often as she wished, it revealed itself, and when she and Mademoiselle got into their hansom cab to drive away, she caught at the Frenchwoman's hand and clung to it, her eyelashes wet. "It is as if there must be a goodness which takes care of one," she said. "I used to believe in it so, until I was afraid of all the world. Dowie means most of all. I did not know how I could bear to let her go away, and since her husband and her daughter died she has no one but me. I should have had no one but her if you had gone back to Belgium, mademoiselle. And now she will be safe in the same house with me. Perhaps the Duchess will keep her until she dies. I hope she will keep me until I die. I will be as good and faithful as Dowie, and perhaps the Duchess will live until I am quite old and not pretty any more. And I will make economies as you have made them, mademoiselle, and save all my salary, and I might be able to end my days in a little cottage in the country." Mademoiselle was conscious of an actual physical drag at her heartstrings. The pulsating glow of her young loveliness had never been more moving, and the sublime certainty of her unconsciousness that life lay between this hour and that day when she was quite old and not pretty any more, and having made economies, could die in a little cottage in the country. She believed in her vision as she had believed that Donal would come to her in the garden. Upon Feather, the revelation that her daughter had elected to join the ranks of girls who were mysteriously determined to be responsible for themselves produced a curious combination of effects. It was presented to her by Lord Coombe in the form of a simple impersonal statement, which had its air of needing no explanation. She heard it with eyes widening a little and a smile slowly growing. Having heard, she broke into a laugh, a rather high-pitched treble laugh. "Really?" she said. "She's really going to do it, to take a situation? She wants to be independent and live her own life. What a joke for a girl of mine!" She was either really amused or chose to seem so. "What do you think of it?" she asked when she stopped laughing. Her eyes had curiosity in them. "I like it," he answered. "Of course. I ought to have remembered that you helped her to an early Victorian duchess. She's one without a flaw, the Dowager Duchess of Dart. The most conscientiously careful mother couldn't object. It's almost like entering into the kingdom of heaven, in a dull way." She began to laugh again, as if amusing images rose suddenly before her. "What does the Duchess think of it?" she said, after her laughter had ceased again. "How does she reconcile herself to the idea of a companion whose mother she wouldn't have in her house?" "We need not enter into that view of the case. You decided some years ago that it did not matter to you whether early Victorian duchesses included you in their visiting lists or did not. More modern ones do, I believe, quite beautiful and amusing ones. But for that reason I want this one and those like her. They would bore me, but I want them. I want them to come to my house and be polite to me in their stuffy way. I want to be invited to their hideous dinner parties and see them sitting round their tables in their awful family jewels, talking of the sad deaths of kings. That's Shakespeare, you know. I heard it last night at the theatre. Why do you want it? Coombe inquired. When I ask you why you show your morbid interest in Robin, you say you don't know. I don't know, but I do want it. She suddenly flushed. She even showed her small teeth. For an extraordinary moment she looked like a little cat. Robin will have it, she cried, grinding a delicate fist into the palm on her knee. She's not 18, and she's a beauty, and she's taken up by a perfectly decent old duchess. She'll have everything. The dowager will marry her to someone important, and you'll help. She turned on him in a flame of temper. You are capable of marrying her yourself. There was a brief but entire silence. It was broken by his saying, She is not capable of marrying me. There was a brief but entire silence again, and it was he who again broke it, his manner at once cool and reasonable. It is better not to exhibit this kind of feeling. Let us be quite frank. There are few things you feel more strongly than that you do not want your daughter in the house. When she was a child, you told me that you detested the prospect of having her on your hands. She is being disposed of in the most easily explained and enviable manner. It's true, Feather murmured. She began to see advantages, and the look of a little cat died out, or at least modified itself into that of a little cat upon whom dawned prospects of cream. No mood ever held her very long. She won't come back to stay, she said. The Duchess won't let her. I can use her rooms, and I shall be very glad to have them. There's at least some advantage in figuring as a sort of dame aux camélias. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of The Head of the House of Coombe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sylviamb. The Head of the House of Coombe by Frances Hodgson Burnett. The night before Robin went away, as she sat alone in the dimness of one light, thinking as girls nearly always sit and think on the eve of a change, because to youth any change seems to mean the final closing as well as the opening of ways. The door of her room was opened, and an exquisite and nymph-like figure in pale green stood exactly where the rays of the reading lamp seemed to concentrate themselves in an effort to reveal most purely its delicately startling effect. It was her mother, in a dress whose spring-like tint made her a sort of slim dryad. She looked so pretty and young that Robin caught her breath as she rose and went forward. "It is your aged parent come to give you her blessing," said Feather. "I was wondering if I might come to your room in the morning," Robin answered. Feather seated herself lightly. She was not intelligent enough to have any real comprehension of the mood which had impelled her to come. She had merely given way to a secret sense of resentment, of something which annoyed her. She knew, however, why she had put on the spring-leaf green dress which made her look like a girl. She was not going to let Robin feel as if she were receiving a visit from her grandmother. She had got that far. "We don't know each other at all, do we?" she said. "No," answered Robin. She could not remove her eyes from her loveliness. She brought up such memories of the lady downstairs and the desolate child in the shabby nursery. "Mothers are not as intimate with their daughters as they used to be, when it was a sort of virtuous fashion to superintend their rice pudding and lecture them about their lessons. We have not seen each other often." "No," said Robin. Feather's laugh had again the rather high note Coombe had noticed. "You haven't very much to say, have you?" she commented. "And you stare at me as if you were trying to explain me. I dare say you know that you have big eyes and that they're a good color, but I may as well hint to you that men do not like to be stared at as if their deeps were being searched. Drop your eyelids." Robin's lids dropped, in spite of herself, because she was startled, but immediately she was startled again by a note in her mother's voice, a note of added irritation. "Don't make a habit of dropping them too often," it broke out, "or it will look as if you did it to show your eyelashes. Girls with tricks of that sort are always laughed at. Alison Carr lives sideways because she has a pretty profile." Coombe would have recognized the little cat look if he had been watching her as she leaned back in her chair and scrutinized her daughter. The fact was that she took in her every point, being an astute censor of other women's charms. "Stand up," she said. Robin stood up because she could not well refuse to do so, but she colored because she was suddenly ashamed. "You're not little, but you're not tall," her mother said. "That's against you. It's the fashion for women to be immensely tall now. Du Maurier's pictures in Punch and his idiotic Trilby did it. Clothes are made for giantesses. I don't care about it myself, but a girl's rather out of it if she's much less than 6 feet high. You can sit down." A more singular interview between mother and daughter had assuredly rarely taken place. As she looked at the girl, her resentment of her increased each moment. She actually felt as if she were beginning to lose her temper. "You are what pious people call going out into the world," she went on. "In moral books, mothers always give advice and warnings to their girls when they're leaving them. I can give you some warnings. You think that because you have been taken up by a dowager duchess, everything will be plain sailing. You're mistaken. You think because you're 18 and pretty, men will fall at your feet." "I would rather be hideous," cried suddenly passionate Robin. "I hate men." The silly, pretty thing who was responsible for her being grew sillier as her irritation increased. "That's what girls always pretend. But the youngest little idiot knows it isn't true. It's men who count. It makes me laugh when I think of them and of you. You know nothing about them, and they know everything about you. A clever man can do anything he pleases with a silly girl." "Are they all bad?" Robin exclaimed furiously. "They're none of them bad. They're only men. And that's my warning. Don't imagine that when they make love to you, they do it as if you were the old duchess's granddaughter. You will only be her paid companion, and that's a different matter." "I will not speak to one of them," Robin actually began. "Oh, you'll be obliged to do what the duchess tells you to do," laughed Feather, as she realized her obvious power to dull the glitter and glow of things which she had felt the girl must be dazzled and uplifted unduly by. She was rather like a spiteful schoolgirl, entertaining herself by spoiling an envied holiday for a companion. "Old men will run after you, and you will have to be nice to them, whether you like it or not." A queer light came into her eyes. "Lord Coombe is fond of girls just out of the schoolroom. But if he begins to make love to you, don't allow yourself to feel too much flattered." Robin sprang toward her. "Do you think I don't abhor Lord Coombe?" she cried out, forgetting herself in the desperate cruelty of the moment. "Haven't I reason—" But there she remembered and stopped. But Feather was not shocked or alarmed. Years of looking things in the face had provided her with a mental surface from which feelings rebounded. On the whole, it even amused her, and suited her book, that Robin should take this tone. "Oh, I suppose what you mean, you know he admires me and pays bills for me. Where would you have been if he hadn't done it? He's been a sort of benefactor." "I know nothing but that even when I was a little child I could not bear to touch his hand," cried Robin. Then Feather remembered several things she had almost forgotten, and she was still more entertained. I believe you've not forgotten through all these years that the boy you fell so indecently in love with was taken away by his mother because Lord Coombe was your mother's admirer, and he was such a sinner that even a baby was contaminated by him. Donal Muir is a young man by this time. I wonder what his mother would do now if he turned up at your mistress's house. Ha! That's what she is, you know, your mistress, and began to make love to you. She laughed outright. You get into all sorts of messes, but that would be the nicest one. Robin could only stand and gaze at her. Her moment's fire had died down. Without warning, out of the past a wave rose and overwhelmed her then and there. It bore with it the wild woe of the morning when a child had waited in the spring sun and her world had fallen into nothingness. It came back, the broken-hearted anguish, the utter, helpless desolation, as if she stood in the midst of it again, as if it had never passed. It was a reincarnation. She could not bear it. "Do you hate me, as I hate Lord Coombe?" she cried out. "Do you want unhappy things to happen to me? Oh, mother, why?" She had never said "mother" before. Nature said it for her here. The piteous appeal of her youth and lonely young rush of tears was almost intolerably sweet. Through some subtle cause it added to the thing in her which Feather resented and longed to trouble and to hurt. "You are a spiteful little cat!" she sprang up to exclaim, standing close and face to face with her. "You think I am an old thing and that I'm jealous of you, because you're pretty and a girl you think women past 30 don't count. You'll find out. Mrs. Muir will count, and she's 40 if she's a day. Her son's such a beauty that people go mad over him, and he worships her, and he's her slave. I wish you would get into some mess you couldn't get out of. Don't come to me if you do." The wild beauty of Robin's gaze and her tear-wet bloom were too much. Feather was quite close to her. The spiteful schoolgirl impulse got the better of her. "Don't make eyes at me like that," she cried, and she actually gave the rose cheek nearest her a sounding little slap. "There!" she exclaimed hysterically, and she turned about and ran out of the room, crying herself. Robin had parted from Mademoiselle Vallée at Charing Cross Station on the afternoon of the same day, but the night before they had sat up late together and talked a long time. In effect, Mademoiselle had said also, "You are going out into the world," but she had not approached the matter in Mrs. Gareth Lawless's mood. One may have charge of a girl and be her daily companion for years, but there are certain things, the very years themselves, make it increasingly difficult to say to her. And after all, why should one state difficult things in exact phrases unless one lacks breeding and is curious? Anxious she had been at times, but not curious. So it was that even on this night of their parting it was not she who spoke. It was after a few minutes of sitting in silence and looking at the fire that Robin broke in upon the quiet which had seemed to hold them both. "I must learn to remember always that I am a sort of servant. I must be very careful. It will be easier for me to realize that I am not in my own house than it would be for other girls. I have not allowed Dowie to dress me for a good many weeks. I have learned how to do everything for myself quite well. But Dowie will be in the house with you, and the Duchess is very kind. Every night I have begun my prayers by thanking God for leaving me Dowie," the girl said. "I have begun them and ended them with the same words." She looked about her, and then broke out as if involuntarily, "I shall be away from here. I shall not wear anything or eat anything or sleep on any bed I have not paid for myself. These rooms are very pretty. We have been very comfortable here," Mademoiselle said. Suddenly she felt that if she waited a few moments she would know definitely things she had previously only guessed at. "Have you no little regrets?" "No," answered Robin. "No." She stood up upon the hearth with her hands behind her. Mademoiselle felt as if her fingers were twisting themselves together, and the Frenchwoman was peculiarly moved by the fact that she looked just like a slim jeune fille of a creature saying a lesson. The lesson opened in this wise. "I don't know when I first began to know that I was different from all other children," she said in a soft, hot voice, if a voice can express heat. "Perhaps a child who has nothing, is obliged to begin to think before it knows what thoughts are. If they play and are loved and amused, they have no time for anything but growing and being happy. You never saw the dreadful little rooms upstairs." "Thou hast told me of them," said Mademoiselle. "Another child might have forgotten them. I never shall. I was so little, and they were full of something awful. It was loneliness. The first time Andrews pinched me was one day when the thing frightened me, and I suddenly began to cry quite loud. I used to stare out of the window, and I don't know when I noticed it first. I could see the children being taken out by their nurses, and there were always 2 or 3 of them, and they laughed and talked and skipped. The nurses used to laugh and talk too. Andrews never did. When she took me to the gardens, the other nurses sat together, chattered, and their children played games with other children. Once a little girl began to talk to me, and her nurse called her away. Andrews was very angry and jerked me by the arm and told me that if I ever spoke to a child again she would pinch me." "Devil!" exclaimed the Frenchwoman. "I used to think and think, but I could never understand. How could I?" "A baby!" cried Mademoiselle Vallée, and she got up and took her in her arms and kissed her. "Cher petit ange," she murmured. When she sat down again her cheeks were wet. Robin's were wet also, but she touched them with her handkerchief quickly and dried them. It was as if she had faltered for a moment in her lesson. "Did Bowie ever tell you anything about Donal?" she asked hesitatingly. "Something. He was the little boy you played with?" "Yes, he was the first human creature." She said it very slowly, as if trying to find the right words to express what she meant. "The first human creature I had ever known. You see, mademoiselle, he knew everything. He had always been happy. He belonged to people and things. I belonged to nobody and nothing. If I had been like him, he would not have seemed so wonderful to me. I was in a kind of delirium of joy. If a creature who had been deaf, dumb, and blind had suddenly awakened and seen on a summer day in a world full of flowers and sun, it might have seemed to them as it seemed to me." "You have remembered it through all the years?" said Mademoiselle. "Like that?" "It was the first time I became alive. One could not forget it. We only played as children play, but it was a delirium of joy. I could not bear to go to sleep at night and forget it for a moment. Yes, I remember it like that. There is a dream I have every now and then, and it is more real than this is," with a wave of her hand about her. "I am always in a real garden, playing with a real Donal, and his eyes. She paused and thought. "There is a look in them that is like, it is just like that first morning." The change which passed over her face the next moment might have been said to seem to obliterate all trace of the childhood memory. "He was taken away by his mother. That was the beginning of my finding out," she said. "I heard Andrews talking to her sister, and in a baby way I gathered that Lord Coombe had sent him. I hated Lord Coombe for years before I found out that he hadn't, and that there was another reason. After that it took time to puzzle things out and piece them together, but at last I found out what the reason had been. Then I began to make plans. These are not my rooms," glancing about her again. "These are not my clothes," with a little pull at her dress. "I am not a strong character, mademoiselle, as I wanted to be, but I haven't one little regret, not one." She kneeled down and put her arms round her old friend's waist, lifting her face. "I'm like a leaf blown about by the wind. I don't know what it will do with me. Where do leaves go? One never knows, really." She put her face down on mademoiselle's knee then, and cried with soft bitterness. When she bade her good-bye at Charing Cross Station, and stood and watched the train until it was quite out of sight. Afterwards she went back to the rooms for which she felt no regrets, and before she went to bed that night, Feather came and gave her farewell maternal advice and warning. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of The Head of the House of Coombe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sylviamb. The Head of the House of Coombe by Frances Hodgson Burnett. That a previously scarcely suspected daughter of Mrs. Gareth Lawless had become a member of the household of the Dowager Duchess of Dart stirred but a passing wave of interest in a circle which was not that of Mrs. Gareth Lawless herself, and which upon the whole but casually acknowledged its curious existence as a modern abnormality. Also, the attitude of the Duchess herself was composedly free from any admission of necessity for comment. "I have no pretty young relative who can be spared to come and live with me. I am fond of things pretty and young, and I am greatly pleased with what a kind chance put in my way," she said. In her discussion of the situation with Coombe, she measured it with her customary fine acumen. 40 years ago it could not have been done. The girl would have been made uncomfortable, and outside things could not have been prevented from dragging themselves in. Filial piety in the mass would have demanded that the mother should be accounted for. Now a genial knowledge of a variety in mothers leaves Mrs. Gareth Lawless to play about with her own probably quite amusing set. Once poor Robin would have been held responsible for her, and so should I. My position would have seemed to defy serious moral issues, but we have reached a sane habit of detaching people from their relations. A nice condition we should be in if we had not. You, of course, know that Henry died suddenly in some sort of fit at Ostend. Coombe said it, as if, in a form of reply. She had naturally become aware of it when the rest of the world did, but had not seen him since the event. "One did not suppose his constitution would have lasted so long," she answered. "You are more fortunate in young Donal Muir. Have you seen him and his mother?" "I made a special journey to Braemarnie, and had a curious interview with Mrs. Muir. When I say curious, I don't mean to imply that it was not entirely dignified. It was curious only because I realize that secretly she regards with horror and dread the fact that her boy is the prospective head of the House of Coombe. She does not make a jest of it, as I have had the temerity to do. It's a cheap defence, this trick of making an eternal jest of things, but it is a defence, and one has formed the habit." "She has never done it, Helen Muir," his friend said. "On the whole, I believe she at times knows that she has been too grave. She was a beautiful creature, passionately in love with her husband. When such a husband is taken away from such a woman and his child is left, it often happens that the flood of her love is turned into one current, and that it is almost overwhelming. She is too sane to have coddled the boy and made him effeminate. What has she done instead? He is a splendid young Highlander. He would be too good-looking if he were not as strong and active as a young stag. All she has done is to so fill him with the power and sense of her charm that he has not seen enough of the world or learned to care for it. She is the one woman on earth for him, and life with her at Braemarnie is all he asks for. Your difficulty will be that she will not be willing to trust him to your instructions." "I have not as much personal vanity as I may seem to have," Coombe said. "I put all egotism modestly aside when I talked to her, and tried to explain that I would endeavour to see that he came to no harm in my society. My heir presumptive and I must see something of each other, and he must become intimate with the prospect of his responsibilities. More will be demanded of the next Marquis of Coombe than has been demanded of me, and it will be demanded, not merely hoped for or expected. And it will be the overwhelming forces of fate which will demand it, no mere tenants or constituents or the general public. Have you any views as to what will be demanded?" was her interested question. None. Neither has anyone else who shares my opinion. No one will have any until the readjustment comes. But before the readjustment there will be the pouring forth of blood, the blood of magnificent lads like Donal Muir, perhaps his own blood. My God! And there may be left no head of the House of Coombe, from the Duchess. There will be many a house left without its head, houses great and small, and if the peril of it were more generally foreseen at this date, it would be less perilous than it is. Lads like that, said the old Duchess bitterly, lads in their strength and joy and bloom. It is hideous. In all their young virility and promise for a next generation, the strong young fathers of forever unborn millions. It's damnable, and it will be so not only in England, but all over a blood-drenched world. It was in this way they talked to each other of the black tragedy for which they believed the world's stage already being set in secret, and though there were here and there others who felt the ominous inevitability of the raising of the curtain, the rest of the world looked on in careless indifference to the significance of the open training of its actors and even the resounding hammerings of its stage carpenters and builders. In these days the two discussed the matter more frequently, and even in the tone of those who waited for the approach of a thing drawing nearer every day. Each time the head of the House of Coombe made one of his so-called week-end visits to the parts an Englishman can reach only by crossing the Channel, he returned with new knowledge of the special direction in which the wind veered in the blowing of those straws he had so long observed with absorbed interest. Above all the common sounds of daily human life, one hears in that one land the rattle and clash of arms and the unending thudding tread of marching feet, he said after one such visit. 2 generations of men, creatures bred and born and trained to live as parts of a huge death-dealing machine, have resulted in a monstrous construction. Each man is a part of it, and each part's greatest ambition is to respond to the shouted word of command as a mechanical puppet responds to the touch of a spring. To each unit of the millions, love of his own country means only hatred of all others, and the belief that no other should be allowed existence. The sacred creed of each is that the immensity of Germany is such that there can be no room on earth for another than itself. Blood and iron will clear the world of the inferior peoples. To the masses, that is their God's will. Their God is an understudy of their Kaiser. You are not saying that as part of the trick of making a jest of things? I wish to God I were. The poor, huge, inhuman thing he has built does not know that when he was a boy he did not play at war and battles as other boys do, but as a creature obsessed. He has played at soldiers with his people as his toys throughout all his morbid life, and he has hungered and thirsted as he has done it. A Bible lay on the table, and the Duchess drew it towards her. There is a verse here, she said. I will find it. She turned the pages and found it. Listen, know this, and lay it to thy heart this day. Jehovah is God in heaven above and on the earth beneath. There is none else. That is a power which does not confine itself to Germany or to England or France or to the map of Europe. It is the law of the universe, and even Wilhelm II cannot bend it to his almighty will. There is none else. There is none else, repeated Coombe slowly. If there existed a human being with the power to drive that home as a truth into his delirious brain, I believe he would die raving mad. To him there is no first cause which was not made in Germany, and it is one of his most valuable theatrical assets. It is part of his paraphernalia, like the jangling of his sword and the glitter of his orders. He shakes it before his people to arrest the attention of the simple and honest ones, as one jingles a rattle before a child. There are those among them who are not so readily attracted by terms of blood and iron. But they will be called upon to shed blood, and to pour forth their own. There will be young things like Donal Muir, lads with ruddy cheeks and with white bodies to be torn to fragments. She shuddered as she said it. "I am afraid," she said. "I am afraid." "So am I," Coombe answered, "of what is coming. What a fool I have been!" "How long will it be before the other men awaken to say the same thing?" "Each man's folly is his own shame." He drew himself stiffly upright, as a man might who stood before a firing squad. "I had a life to live or to throw away. Because I was hideously wounded at the outset, I threw it aside as done for. I said, 'There is neither God nor devil, vice nor virtue, love nor hate. I will do and leave undone what I choose.' I had power and brain and money. A man who could see clearly and who had words to choose from might have stood firmly in the place to which he was born, and have spoken in a voice which might have been listened to. He might have fought against folly and blindness and lassitude. I deliberately chose privately to sneer at the thought of lifting a hand to serve anything but the cold fool who was myself. Life passes quickly. It does not turn back." He ended with a short, harsh laugh. "This is fear," he said. "Fear clears a man's mind of rubbish and non-essentials. It is because I am afraid that I accuse myself. And it is not for myself or you, but for the whole world, which before the end comes will seem to fall into fragments." "You have been seeing ominous signs?" the Duchess said, leaning forward and speaking low. "There have been affectionate visits to Vienna. There is a certain thing in the air, in the arrogance of the bearing of men clanking their sabres as they stride through the streets. There is an exultant eagerness in their eyes. Things are said which hold scarcely concealed braggart threats. They have always been given to that sort of thing, but now it strikes one as a thing unleashed, or barely leashed at all. The background of the sound of clashing arms and the thudding of marching feet is more unendingly present. One cannot get away from it. The great munition factories are working night and day. In the streets, in private houses, in the shops, one hears and recognizes signs. They are signs which might not be clear to one who has not spent years in looking on with interested eyes. But I have watched too long to see only the surface of things. The nation is waiting for something, waiting." "What will be the pretext? What?" the Duchess pondered. "Any pretext will do, or none. Except that Germany must have what she wants, and that she is strong enough to take it, after 40 years of building her machine. And we others have built none. We almost deserve whatever comes to us." The old woman's face was darkly grave. "In 3 villages where I chance to be the lord of the manor, I have by means of my own set lads drilling and training. It is supposed to be a form of amusement and an eccentric whim of mine, and it is a change from eternal cricket. I have given prizes and made an occasional speech on the ground that English brawn is so enviable a possession that it ought to develop itself to the utmost. When I once went to the length of adding that each Englishman should be muscle-fit and ready in case of England's sudden need, I saw the lads grin cheerfully at the thought of England in any such un-English plight. Their innocent swaggering belief that the country is always ready for everything moved my heart of stone. And it is men like myself who are to blame, not merely men of my class, but men of my kind, those who have chosen to detach themselves from everything but the living of life as it best pleased their tastes or served their personal ambitions." "Are we going to be taught that man cannot argue without including his fellow man? Are we going to be forced to learn it?" she said. "Yes, forced. Nothing but force could reach us. The race is an undeveloped thing. A few centuries later it will have evolved another sense. This century may see the first huge step, because the power of a cataclysm sweeps it forward." He turned his glance towards the opening door. Robin came in with some letters in her hand. He was vaguely aware that she wore an aspect he was unfamiliar with. The girl of Mrs. Gareth Lawless had in the past, as it went without saying, expressed the final note of priceless simplicity in mode. The more finely simple she looked, the more priceless. The unfamiliarity in her outward seeming lay in the fact that her quite done tweed dress, with its lines of white at neck and wrists, was not priceless, though it was well made. It, in fact, unobtrusively suggested that it was meant for service rather than for adornment. Her hair was dressed closely, and her movements were very quiet. Coombe realized that her greeting of him was delicately respectful. "I have finished the letters," she said to the Duchess. "I hope they are what you want. Sometimes I am afraid—" "Don't be afraid," said the Duchess kindly. "You write very correct and graceful little letters. They're always what I want. Have you been out today?" "Not yet." Robin hesitated a little. "Have I your permission to ask Mrs. James if it will be convenient to her to let Dowie go with me for an hour?" "Yes," as kindly as before. "For 2 hours, if you like. I shall not drive this afternoon." "Thank you," said Robin, and went out of the room as quietly as she had entered it. When the door closed, the Duchess was smiling at Lord Coombe. "I understand her," she said. "She is sustained and comforted by her pretty air of servitude. She might use Dowie as her personal maid and do next to nothing, but she waits upon herself and punctiliously asks my permission to approach Mrs. James, the housekeeper, with any request for a favour. Her one desire is to be sure that she is earning her living, as other young women do when they are paid for their work. I should really like to pet and indulge her, but it would only make her unhappy. I invent tasks for her which are quite unnecessary. For years the little shut-up soul has been yearning and praying for this opportunity to stand honestly on her own feet, and she can scarcely persuade herself that it has been given to her. It must not be spoiled for her. I send her on errands my maid could perform. I have given her a little room with a serious business air. It is full of files and papers, and she sits in it and copies things for me, and even looks over accounts. She is clever at looking up references. I have let her sit up quite late once or twice, searching for detail and dates for my use. It made her bloom with joy. "You are quite the most delightful woman in the world," said Coombe. "Quite." End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of The Head of the House of Coombe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sylviamb. The Head of the House of Coombe by Frances Hodgson Burnett. In the serious little room the Duchess had given to her, Robin built for herself a condition she called happiness. She drew the spiritual substance from which it was made from her pleasure in the books of reference closely fitted into their shelves, in the files for letters and more imposing documents, in the varieties of letter paper and envelopes of different sizes and materials which had been provided for her use in case of necessity. "You may not use the more substantial ones often, but you must be prepared for any unexpected contingency," the Duchess had explained, thereby smoothing her pathway by the suggestion of responsibilities. The girl did not know the extent of her employer's consideration for her, but she knew that she was kind, with a special grace and comprehension. A subtle truth she also did not recognize was that the remote flame of her own being was fiercely alert in its readiness to leap upward at any suspicion that her duties were not worth the payment made for them, and that for any reason which might include Lord Coombe she was occupying a position which was a sinecure. She kept her serious little room in order herself, dusting and almost polishing the reference books, arranging and rearranging the files with such exactness of system that she could, as is the vaunt of the model of orderly perfection, lay her hands upon any document in the dark. She was punctuality's self, and held herself in readiness at any moment to appear at the Duchess's side, as if a magician had instantaneously transported her there before the soft, melodious private bell connected with her room had ceased to vibrate. The correctness of her deference to the convenience of Mrs. James, the housekeeper, in her simplest communication with Dowie, quite touched that respectable person's heart. "She's a young lady," Mrs. James remarked to Dowie, "and a credit to you and her governess, Mrs. Dowson. Young ladies have gone almost out of fashion. Mademoiselle Vallée has spent her governess in days among the highest. My own places were always with gentle people. Nothing ever came near her that could spoil her manners. A good heart she was born with," was the civil reply of Dowie. "Nothing ever came near her?" Mrs. James politely checked what she became conscious was a sort of unconscious exclamation. "Nothing," said Dowie, going on with her sheet hemming steadily. Robin wrote letters and copied various documents for the Duchess. She went shopping with her and executed commissions to order. She was allowed to enter into correspondence with the village schoolmistress and the wife of the vicar at Dartnorham, and to buy prizes for notable decorum and scholarship in the school, and baby linen and blankets for the maternity bag, and other benevolences. She liked buying prizes and the baby clothes very much, because, though she was unaware of the fact, her youth delighted in youngness and the fulfilling of young desires. Even oftener and more significantly than ever did eyes turn towards her, try to hold hers, look after her eagerly when she walked in the streets or drove with the Duchess in the high-swung barouche. More and more she became used to it, and gradually she ceased to be afraid of it and began to feel it nearly always, there were sometimes exceptions, a friendly thing. She saw friendliness in it because when she caught sight, as she so often did, of young things like herself passing in pairs, laughing and talking and turning to look into each other's eyes, her being told her that it was sweet and human and inevitable. They always turned and looked at each other, these pairs, and then they smiled or laughed or flushed a little, as she had not known when first she recognized, as she looked down into the street from her nursery window, that the children nearly always passed in twos or threes, and laughed and skipped and talked. So she did not know when she first began to notice these joyous young pairs, and a certain touch of exultation in them, and feel that it was sweet, and quite a simple, common, natural thing. Her noting and being sometimes moved by it was as natural as her pleasure in the opening of spring flowers or the new thrill of spring birds, but she did not know that either. The brain, which has worked through many years in unison with the soul to which it was apportioned, has evolved a knowledge which has deep cognizance of the universal law. The brain of the old Duchess had so worked, keeping pace always with its guide, never visualizing the possibility of working alone, also never falling into the abyss of that human folly whose conviction is that all that one sees and gives a special name to is all that exists, or that the names accepted by the world justly and clearly describe qualities, yearnings, moods, as they are. This had developed within her wide perception and a wisdom which was sane and kind to tenderness. As she drove through the streets with Robin beside her, she saw the following eyes. She saw the girl's soft, friendly look at the young creatures who passed her, glowing and uplifted by the joy of life, and she was moved and even disturbed. After her return from one particular morning's outing, she sent for Dowie. "You have taken care of Miss Robin since she was a little child?" she began. "She was not quite 6 when I first went to her, your Grace." "You are not of the women who only feed and bathe a child and keep her well dressed. You have been a sort of mother to her." "I've tried to, your Grace. I've loved her and watched over her, and she's loved me, I do believe." "That is why I want to talk to you about her, Dowie. If you were the woman who merely comes and goes in a child's life, I could not. She is a very beautiful young thing, Dowie. From her little head to her slim bits of feet, your Grace. No one knows better than I do." The Duchess's renowned smile revealed itself. "A beautiful young thing ought to see and know other beautiful young things and make friends with them. That is one of the reasons for their being put in the world. Since she has been with me, she has spoken to no one under 40. Has she never had young friends?" "Never, your Grace." Once 2 young baggages were left to have tea with her, and they talked to her about divorce scandals and correspondence. She never wanted to see them again. Dowie's face set itself in lines of perfectly correct inexpressiveness, and she added, "They set her asking me questions I couldn't answer, and she broke down because she suddenly understood why. No, your Grace, she's not known those of her own age. She is, of the ignorance of a child." The Duchess thought it out slowly. "She thinks not, poor lamb, but she is," Dowie answered. The Duchess's eyes met hers, and they looked at each other for a moment. Dowie tried to retain a non-committal steadiness, and the Duchess, observing the intention, knew that she was free to speak. "Lord Coombe confided to me that she had passed through a hideous danger which had made a lasting impression on her." She said it in a low voice. "He told me because he felt it would explain certain reserves and fears in her." "Sometimes she wakes up out of nightmares about it," said Dowie, "and she creeps into my room shivering, and I take her into my bed and hold her in my arms until she's over the panic. She says the worst of it is that she keeps thinking that there may have been other girls trapped like her, and that they did not get away." The Duchess was very thoughtful. She saw the complications in which such a horror would involve a girl's mind. "If she consorted with other young things, and talked nonsense with them, and shared their pleasures, she would forget it," she said. "Ah!" exclaimed Dowie, "that's it." The question in the Duchess's eyes, when she lifted them, required an answer, and she gave it respectfully. "The thing that happened was only the last touch put to what she'd gradually been finding out as she grew from child to a young girl. The ones she would like to know, she said it in plain words once to Mademoiselle, might not want to know her. I must take the liberty of speaking plain, your Grace, or it's no use me speaking at all. She holds it deep in her mind that she's a sort of young outcast. I must convince her that she is not." It was the beginning of what the Duchess had meant to say, but she actually found herself pausing, held for the moment by Dowie's quiet, civil eye. "Was your Grace, in your kindness, thinking," was what the excellent woman said. "Yes, that I would invite young people to meet her, help them to know each other and to make friends." And even as she said it, she was conscious of being slightly under the influence of Dowie's wise gaze. "Your Grace only knows those young people she would like to know." It was a mere simple statement. "People are not as censorious as they once were." Her Grace's tone was intended to reply to the suggestion lying in the words, which had worn the air of statement without comment. "Some are not, but some are," Dowie answered. "There's 2 worlds in London now, your Grace. One is your Grace's, and one is Mrs. Gareth Lawless's. I have heard say there are others between, but I only know those 2. The Duchess pondered again. "You are thinking that what Miss Robin said to Mademoiselle Villette might be true in mine, and perhaps you are not altogether wrong, even if you are not altogether right. Until I went to take care of Miss Robin, I had only had places in families Mrs. Gareth Lawless's set didn't touch anywhere. What I'm remembering is that there was a strictness shown sometimes, even when it seemed a bit harsh. Among the servants, the older ones said that it was because of the new sets and their fast, wicked ways. One of my young ladies once met another young lady about her own age, she was just 15, at the Charity Bazaar, and they made friends and liked each other very much. The young lady's mother was one there was a lot of talk about in connection with a person of very high station, the highest, your Grace, and everyone knew. The girl was a lovely little creature, and beautifully behaved. It was said her mother wanted to push her into the world she couldn't get into herself. The acquaintance was stopped, your Grace. It was put a stop to at once, and my poor little young lady quite broke her heart over it, and I heard it was much worse for the other." "I will think this over," the Duchess said. "It needs thinking over." I wish to talk to you because I have seen that she has fixed little ideas regarding what she thinks is suited to her position as a paid companion, and she might not be prepared. I wish you to see that she has a pretty little frock or so which she could wear if she required them. She has two, your grace. Dowie smiled affectionately as she said it. One for evening, and one for special afternoon wear, in case your grace needed her to attend you for some reason. They are as plain as she dare make them, but when she puts one on she can't help giving it a look. Yes, she would give it all it needed, her grace said. Thank you, Dowie. You may go. With her sketch of a respectful curtsy, Dowie went towards the door. As she approached it, her step became slower. Before she reached it, she had stopped, and there was a remarkable look on her face, a suddenly heroic look. She turned and made several steps backward, and paused again, which unexpected action caused the Duchess to turn to glance at her. When she glanced, her grace recognized the heroic look, and waited, with a consciousness of some slight new emotion within herself, for its explanation. "Your grace," Dowie began, asking God himself to give courage if she was doing right, and to check her if she was making a mistake. "When your grace was thinking of the parents of other young ladies and gentlemen, did it come to you to put it to yourself whether you'd be willing—" She caught her breath, but ended quite clearly, respectfully, reasonably. "Lady Catherine, Lord Halwyn." Lady Catherine was the Duchess's young granddaughter. Lord Halwyn was her extremely good-looking grandson, who is in the army. The Duchess understood what the heroic look had meant, and her respect for it was great. Its intention had not been to suggest inclusion of George and Catherine in her plan. It had only, with pure justice, put it to her to ask herself what her own personal decision in such a matter would be. "You do feel as if you were her mother," she said, "and you are a practical, clear-minded woman. It is only if I myself am willing to take such a step that I have a right to ask it of other people. Lady Lothwell is the mother I must speak to first. Her children are mine, though I am a mere grandmother." Lady Lothwell was her daughter, and though she was not regarded as Victorian, either of the early or middle periods, Dowie, as she returned to her own comfortable quarters, wondered what would happen. End of chapter 29.
Chapter 30 of The Head of the House of Coombe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Stacey M. The Head of the House of Coombe by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 30. What did occur was not at all complicated. It would not have been possible for a woman to have spent her girlhood with the cleverest mother of her day and have emerged from her training either obstinate or illogical. Lady Lothwell listened to as much of the history of Robin as her mother chose to tell her, and plainly felt an amiable interest in it. She knew much more detail and gossip concerning Mrs. Gareth Lawless than the Duchess herself did. She had heard of the child who was kept out of sight, and she had been somewhat disgusted by a vague story of Lord Coombe's abnormal interest in it, and the ugly hint that he had an object in view. It was too unpleasantly morbid to be true of a man her mother had known for years. "Of course you were not thinking of anything large or formal," she said after a moment of smiling hesitation. "No, I am not launching a girl into society. I only want to help her to know a few nice young people who are good-natured and well-mannered. She is not the ordinary old lady's companion, and if she were not so strict with herself and with me, I confess I should behave towards her very much as I should behave to Catherine, if you could spare her to live with me. She is a heartwarming young thing, because I am known to have one of my eccentric fancies for her, and because, after all, her father was well connected. Her present position will not be the obstacle. She is not the first modern girl who has chosen to support herself. But isn't she much too pretty? Much, but she doesn't flaunt it. But heartwarming and too pretty, dearest mamma." Lady Lothwell laughed again. "She can do no harm to Catherine, but I own that, if George were not at present quite madly in love with a darling being, at least 15 years older than himself, I should pause to reflect. Mrs. Stacey will keep him steady, Mrs. Alan Stacey. You know, the one with the magnificent henna hair and the eyes that droop. No boy of 22 can resist her. They call her adorers the infant school. A small dinner and a small dance, and George and Catherine may be the beginning of an interesting experiment. It would be pretty and kind of you to drop in during the course of the evening. Are you hoping to perhaps make a marriage for her? Lady Lothwell asked the question a shade disturbedly. You are so amazing, Mamma darling, that I know you will do it if you believe in it. You seem to be able to cause the things you really want, to evolve from the universe. She is the kind of girl whose place in the universe is in the home of some young man, whose own place in the universe is in the heart and soul and life of her kind of girl. They ought to carry out the will of God by falling passionately in love with each other. They ought to marry each other and have a large number of children as beautiful and rapturously happy as themselves. They would assist in the evolution of the race. Oh, Mamma, how delightful you always are! For a really brilliant woman, you are the most adorable dreamer in the world. Dreams are the only things which are true. The rest are nothing but visions. Angel, her daughter laughed a little adoringly as she kissed her. I will do whatever you want me to do. I always did, didn't I? It's your way of making one see what you see when you are talking that does it. It was understood before they parted that Catherine and George would be present at the small dinner and the small dance, and that a few other agreeable young persons might be trusted to join them, and that Lady Lothwell and perhaps her husband would drop in. It's your being almost early Victorian, Mamma, which makes it easy for you to initiate things. You will initiate little Miss Lawless. It was rather neat of her to prefer to drop the Gareth. There has been less talk in late years of the different classes keeping their places. Upper and lower classes really strikes one as vulgar. We may keep our places, the Duchess said. We may hold on to them as firmly as we please. It is the places themselves which are moving, my dear. It is not unlike the beginning of a landslide. Robin went to Dowie's room the next evening and stood a moment in silence watching her sewing before she spoke. She looked anxious and even pale. Her Grace is going to give a party to some young people, Dowie, she said. She wishes me to be present. I don't know what to do. What you must do, my dear, is to put on your best evening frock and go downstairs and enjoy yourself as the other young people will. Her Grace wants you to see someone your own age, was Dowie's answer. But I am not like the others. I am only a girl earning her living as a companion. How do I know? Her Grace knows, Dowie said. And what she asks you to do, it is your duty to do, and do it prettily. Robin lost even a shade more color. Do you realize that I have never been to a party in my life? Not even to a children's party, Dowie. I shall not know how to behave myself. You know how to talk nicely to people, and you know how to sit down and rise from your chair and move about a room like a quiet young lady. You dance like a fairy. You won't be asked to do anything more. The Duchess, reflected Robin aloud slowly, would not let me come downstairs if she did not know that people would be kind. Lady Catherine and Lord Halwyn are coming. They are her own grandchildren, Dowie said. How did you know that? Robin inquired. Robin's color began to come back. It's not what usually happens to girls in situations, she said. Her Grace herself isn't what usually happens, said Dowie. There is no one like her for high wisdom and kindness. Having herself awakened to the truth of this confidence-inspiring fact, Robin felt herself supported by it. One knew what far-sighted perception and clarity of experienced vision this one woman had gained during her many years of life. If she had elected to do this thing, she had seen her path clear before her and was not offering a gift, which awkward chance might spoil or snatch away from the hand held out to receive it. A curious slow warmth began to creep about Robin's heart, and in its mounting gradually fill her being. It was true she had been taught to dance, to move about and speak prettily. She had been taught a great many things which seemed to be very carefully instilled into her mind and body without any special reason. She had not been aware that Lord Coombe and Mademoiselle Vallée had directed and discussed her training as if it had been that of a young royal person, whose equipment must be a flawless thing. If the Dowager Duchess of Dart had wished to present her at court some fair morning, she would have known the length of the train she must wear, where she must make her curtsies, and to whom and to what depth, how to kiss the royal hand, and how to manage her train when she retired from the presence. When she had been taught this, she had asked Mademoiselle Vallée if the training was part of every girl's education, and Mademoiselle had answered, "It is best to know everything, even ceremonials which may or may not prove of use. It all forms part of a background, and prevents one from feeling unfamiliar with customs." When she had passed the young pairs in the streets, she had found an added interest in them because of this background. She could imagine them dancing together in fairy ballrooms, whose lights and colors her imagination was obliged to construct for her out of its own fabric. She knew what the girls would look like if they went to a drawing room, and she often wondered if they would feel shy when the page spread out their lovely peacock tails for them and left them to their own devices. It was mere nature that she should have pondered, and sometimes unconsciously longed to feel herself part of the flood of being sweeping past her as she stood apart on the brink of the river. The warmth about her heart made it beat a little faster. She opened the door of her wardrobe when she found herself in her bedroom. The dress hung modestly in its corner, shrouded from the penetration of London fogs by clean sheeting. It was only white, and as simple as she knew how to order it, but Mademoiselle had taken her to a young French person who knew exactly what she was doing in all cases, and because the girl had the supple lines of a wood nymph and the eyes of young antelope, she had evolved that which expressed her as a petal expresses its rose. Robin locked her door and took the dress down, and found the silk stockings and slippers which belonged to it. She put them all on standing before her long mirror, and having left no ungiven last touch, she fell a few steps backward and looked at herself, turning and balancing herself as a bird might have done. She turned lightly round and round. "Yes, I am," she said. "I am very—" The next instant she laughed at herself outright. "How silly, she said. "Almost everybody is, more or less. I wonder if I remember the new steps," for she had been taught the new steps, the new walking and swayings and pauses and sudden swirls and swoops, and her new dress was as short as other fashionable girls' dresses were, but in her case revealed a haunting delicacy of contour and line. So before her mirror she danced alone, and as she danced her lips parted, and her breast rose and fell charmingly, and her eyes lighted and glowed as any girl's might have done, or as a joyous girl nymph's might have lighted as she danced by a pool in her forest, seeing her loveliness mirrored there. Something was awakening, as something had awakened when Donal had kissed a child under the soot-sprinkled London trees. End of chapter 30.
Chapter 31 of The Head of the House of Coombe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sylviamb. The Head of the House of Coombe by Frances Hodgson Burnett. The whole day before the party was secretly exciting to Robin. She knew how much more important it seemed to her than it really was. If she had been 6 years old, she might have felt the same kind of uncertain thrills and tremulous wonders. She hid herself behind the window curtains in her room, that she might see the men putting up the crimson and white awning from the door to the carriage step. The roll of red carpet they took from their van had a magic air. The ringing of the doorbell, which meant that things were being delivered, the extra moving about of the servants, the florist's men who went into the drawing-rooms and brought flowers and big tropical plants to rearrange the conservatory and fill corners which were not always decorated. Each and every one of them quickened the beating of her pulses. If she had belonged in her past to the ordinary, cheerful world of children, she would have felt by this time no such elation. But she had only known of the existence of such festivities as children's parties because once a juvenile ball had been given in a house opposite her mother's, and she had crouched in an almost delirious little heap by the nursery window, watching carriages drive up and deposit fluffy pink and white and blue children upon the strip of red carpet, and had seen them led or running into the house. She had caught sounds of strains of music, and had shivered with rapture. But oh! what worlds away from her the party had been! She found her way into the drawing-rooms, which were not usually thrown open. They were lofty and stately, and seemed to her immense. There were splendid crystal-dropping chandeliers and sidelights, which she thought looked as if they would hold 1,000 wax candles. There was a delightfully embowered corner for the musicians. It was all spacious and wonderful in its beautiful completeness, its preparedness for pleasure. She realized that all of it had always been waiting to be used for the happiness of people who knew each other and were young and ready for delight. When the young Lothwells had been children, they had had dances and frolicking games with other children in the huge rooms, and had kicked up their young heels on the polished floors at Christmas parties and on birthdays. How wonderful it must have been! But they had not known it was wonderful. As Dowie dressed her, the reflections she saw in the mirror gave back to her an intensified Robin, whose curved lips almost quivered as they smiled. The soft silk of her hair looked like the night, and the small rings on the back of her very slim white neck were things to ensnare the eye and hold it helpless. "You look your best, my dear," Dowie said, as she clasped her little necklace, "and it is a good best." Dowie was feeling tremulous herself, though she could not have explained why. She thought that perhaps it was because she wished that Mademoiselle could have been with her. Robin kissed her when the last touch had been given. "I'm going to run down the staircase," she said. "If I let myself walk slowly, I shall have time to feel queer and shy, and I might seem to creep into the drawing-room. I mustn't creep in. I must walk in as if I had been to parties all my life." She ran down, and as she did so she looked like a white bird flying. But she was obliged to stop upon the landing before the drawing-room door to quiet a moment of excited breathing. Still, when she entered the room, she moved as she should and held her head poised with a delicately fearless air. The Duchess, who herself looked her best in her fine old ivory-profiled way, gave her a pleased smile of welcome, which was almost affectionate. "What a perfect little frock," she said. "You are delightfully pretty in it." "Is it quite right?" said Robin. "Mademoiselle chose it for me." "It is quite right. Frightfully right, George would say. George will sit near you at dinner. He is my grandson, Lord Halwyn, you know, and you will no doubt frequently hear him say things are frightfully something or other during the evening. Catherine will say things are divy or exquig. I mention it because you may not know that she means exquisite and divine. Don't let it frighten you if you don't quite understand their language. They are dear, handsome things sweeping along in the rush of their bit of century. I don't let it frighten me that their world seems to me an entirely new planet." Robin drew a little nearer her. She felt something as she had felt years ago when she had said to Dowie, "I want to kiss you, Dowie." Her eyes were pools of childish tenderness, because she so well understood the infinitude of the friendly tact which drew her within its own circle with the light humour of its "I don't let them frighten me." "You are kind, kind to me," she said, "and I am grateful, grateful." The extremely good-looking young people who began very soon to drift into the brilliant big room, singly or in pairs of brother and sister, filled her with innocent delight. They were so well built and gaily at ease with each other and their surroundings, so perfectly dressed and finished. The filmy narrowness of delicate frocks, the shortness of skirts accentuated the youth and girlhood and added it to a sort of child fairy-likeness. Catherine, in exquisite wisps of silver-embroidered gauze, looked 14 instead of nearly 20, aided by a dimple in her cheek and a small tilted nose. A girl in scarlet tulle was like a child out of a nursery, ready to dance about a Christmas tree. Everyone seemed so young and so suggested supple dancing, perhaps because dancing was going on everywhere, and all the world, whether fashionable or unfashionable, was driven by a passion for whirling, swooping, and inventing new postures and fantastic steps. The young men had slim, straight bodies and light movements. Their clothes fitted their suppleness to perfection. Robin thought they all looked as if they had had a great deal of delightful exercise and plenty of pleasure all their lives. They were of that stream which had always seemed to be rushing past her in bright pursuit of alluring things which belonged to them as part of their existence, but which had had nothing to do with her own youth. Now the stream had paused, as if she had for the moment some connection with it. The swift light she was used to seeing illuminate glancing eyes as she passed people in the street, she saw again and again as new arrivals appeared. Catherine was quite excited by her eyes and eyelashes, and George hovered about. There was a great deal of hovering. At the dinner table, sleek young heads held themselves at an angle which allowed of their owners seeing through or around or under floral decorations, and alert young eyes showed an eager gleam. After dinner was over and dancing began, the Duchess smiled shrewdly as she saw the gravitating masculine movement towards a certain point. It was the point where Robin stood, with a small growing circle about her. It was George who danced with her first. He was tall and slender and flexible, and his good shoulders had a military squareness of build. He had also a nice square face, and a warmly blue eye, and knew all the latest steps and curves and unexpected swirls. Robin was an osier wand, and there was no swoop or dart or sudden sway and change she was not alert at. The swing and lure of the music, the swift movement, the fluttering of airy draperies as Slim's sister nymphs flew past her, set her pulses beating with sweet young joy. A brief, uncontrollable ripple of laughter broke from her before she had circled the room twice. "Oh, how heavenly it is!" she exclaimed, and lifted her eyes to Halwyn's. "How heavenly!" They were not safe eyes to lift in such a way to those of a young man. They gave George a sudden enjoyable shock. He had heard of the girl, who was a sort of sublimated companion to his grandmother. The Duchess herself had talked to him a little about her, and he had come to the party intending to behave very amiably and help the little thing enjoy herself. He had also encountered before in houses where there were no daughters the smart, well-born young companion who was allowed all sorts of privileges because she knew how to assume tiresome little responsibilities, and how to be entertaining enough to add cheer and spice to the life of the elderly and lonely. Sometimes she was a subtly appealing sort of girl, and given to being sympathetic and to liking sympathy and quiet corners in conservatories or libraries. And sometimes she was capable of scientific flirtation and required scientific management. A man had to have his wits about him. This one, as she flew like a blown leaf across the floor and laughed up into his face with wide eyes, produced a new effect and was a new kind. "It's you who are heavenly," he answered, with a boy's laugh. "You are like a feather and a willow wand." "You are light, too," she laughed back, "and you are like steel as well." Mrs. Allan Stacey, the lady with the magnificent henna hair, had recently given less time to him, being engaged in the preliminary instruction of a new member of the infant class. Such things will of course happen, and though George had quite ingenuously raged in secret, the circumstances left him free to hover, and hovering was a pastime he enjoyed. "Let us go on like this for ever and ever," he said, sweeping half the length of the room with her and whirling her as if she were indeed a leaf in the wind. "For ever and ever." "I wish we could, but the music will stop," she gave back. "Music ought never to stop, never," he answered. But the music did stop, and when it began again almost immediately another tall, flexible young man made a lightning claim on her, and carried her away only to hand her to another, and he in his turn to another. She was not allowed more than a moment's rest, and borne on the crest of the wave of young delight she did not need more. Young eyes were always laughing into hers, and elating her by a special look of pleasure in everything she did or said or inspired in themselves. How was she informed without phrases that for this exciting evening she was a creature without a flaw, that the loveliness of her eyes startled those who looked into them, that it was a thrilling experience to dance with her, that somehow she was new and apart and wonderful? No sleek-haired, slim, and straight-backed youth said exactly any of these things to her, but somehow they were conveyed, and filled her with a wondering realization of the fact that if they were true, they were no longer dreadful and maddening, since they only made people like and want to dance with one. To dance, to like people and be liked, seemed so heavenly natural and right. To be only like air and sky and free, happy, breathing, there was, it was true, a blissful, little uplifted look about her which she herself was not aware of, but which was singularly stimulating to the masculine beholder. It only meant, indeed, that as she whirled and swayed and swooped, laughing, she was saying to herself at intervals, "This is what other girls feel like. They're happy like this. I am laughing and talking to people just as other girls do. I am Robin Gareth Lawless, but I am enjoying a party like this, a young party." Lady Lothwell, sitting near her mother, watched the trend of affairs with an occasional queer, interested smile. "Well, mamma, darling," she said at last, as youth and beauty whirled by in a maelstrom of modern terpsichorean liveliness, "she is a great success. I don't know whether it is quite what you intended or not." The Duchess did not explain what she had intended. She was watching the trend also, and thinking a good deal. On the whole, Lady Lothwell had scarcely expected that she would explain. She rarely did. She seldom made mistakes, however. Catherine, in her scant, gauzy strips of white and silver, having drifted towards them, at the moment stood looking on with a funny little disturbed expression on her small, tip-tilted face. "There's something about her, grandmamma," she said. "All the girls see it, and no one knows what it is. She's sitting out for a few minutes, and just look at George, and Hal Brunton, and Captain Willis. They're all laughing, of course, and pretending to joke, but they would like to eat each other up. Perhaps it's her eyelashes. She looks out from under them as if there were a curtain." Lady Lothwell's queer little smile became a queer little laugh. "Yes, it gives her a look of being ecstatically happy, and yet almost shy and appealing at the same time. Men can't stand it, of course." "None of them are trying to stand it," answered little Lady Catherine, somewhat in the tone of a retort. "I don't believe she knows she does it," Lady Lothwell said, quite reflectively. "She does not know at all. That is the worst of it," commented the Duchess. "Then you see that there is a worst," said her daughter. The Duchess glanced toward Catherine, but fortunately the puzzled fret of the girl's forehead was even at the moment melting into a smile as a young man of much attraction descended upon her with smiles of his own, and carried her onto the tango or foxtrot or antelope gallop, whichsoever it chanced to be. If she were really aware of it, that would be the worst. For other people, for us, probably. She could look out from under her lashes to sufficient purpose to call what she wanted and take and keep it. As she is not aware, it will make things less easy for herself under the circumstances. The circumstances of being Mrs. Gareth Lawless's daughter is not an agreeable one," said Lady Lothwell. "It might give some adventurous boys ideas when they had time to realize all it means. Do you know, I am rather sorry for her myself. I shouldn't be surprised if she were rather a dear little thing. She looks tender and cuddlesome. Perhaps she is like the heroine of a sentimental novel I read the other day. Her chief slave said of her, 'She walks into a man's heart through his eyes, and sits down there and makes a warm place which will never get cold again.' Rather nice, I thought." The Duchess thought it rather nice also. "Never get cold again," she repeated. "What a heavenly thing to happen to a pair of creatures if—" She paused, and regarded Robin, who, at the other side of the room, was trying to decide some parlous question of dances to which there was more than one claimant. She was sweetly puckering her brow over her card, and around her were youthful male faces, looking eager and even a trifle tense with repressed anxiety for the victory of the moment. "Oh!" Lady Lothwell laughed. "As Kitty says, there's something about her, and it's not mere eyelashes. You have let loose a germ among us, mamma, my sweet, and you can't do anything with a germ when you have let it loose. To quote Kitty again, look at George." The music, which came from the bower behind which the musicians were hidden, seemed to gain thrill and wildness as the hours went on, as the rooms grew warmer, and the flowers breathed out more reaching scent. Now and again Robin paused for a moment to listen to strange, delightful chords, and to inhale passing waves of something like mignonette and lilies, and apple blossoms in the sun. She thought there must be some flower which was like all three in one. The rushing stream was carrying her with it as it went, one of the happy petals on its surface. Could it ever cast her aside and leave her on the shore again? While the violins went singing on, and the 1,000 wax candles shone on the faint or vivid colours which mingled into a sort of lovely haze, it did not seem possible that a thing so enchanting and so real could have an end at all. All the other things in her life seemed less real tonight. In the conservatory there was a marble fountain, which had long years ago been brought from the palace garden in Rome. It was not as large as it was beautiful, and it had been placed among palms and tropic ferns whose leaves and fronds it splashed merrily among and kept deliciously cool and wet-looking. There was a quite intoxicating hothouse perfume of warm, damp moss and massed flowers, and it was the kind of corner any young man would feel it necessary to gravitate towards with a partner. George led Robin to it, and she naturally sat upon the edge of the marble basin, and as naturally drew off a glove and dipped her hand into the water, splashing it a little because it felt deliciously cool. George stood near her at first, and looked down at her bent head. It was impossible not also to take in her small, fine ear, and the warm velvet white of the lovely little nape of her slim neck. He took them in with elated appreciation. He was not subtle-minded enough to be aware that her reply to a casual remark he had made to her at dinner had had a remote effect upon him. "One of the loveliest creatures I ever saw was a Mrs. Gareth Lawless," he had said. "Are you related to her?" "I am her daughter," Robin had answered. And with a slightly startled sensation he had managed to slip into amiably deft generalities, while he had secretly wondered how much his grandmother knew or did not know. An involuntary thought of Feather had crossed his mind once or twice during the evening. This was the girl who, it was said, had actually been saved up for old Coombe. Ugly, morbid sort of idea if it was true. How had the Duchess got hold of her, and why, and what was Coombe really up to? Could he have some elderly idea of wanting a youngster for a wife? Occasionally an old chap did. Serve him right if some young chap took the wind out of his sails. He was not a desperate character, but he had been very intimate with Mrs. Allan Stacey and her friends, and it had made him careless. Also, Robin had drawn him more than he knew. "Is it still heavenly?" he asked. How pointed her fingers were, and how soft and crushable her hand looked as it splashed like a child's. "More heavenly every minute," she answered. He laughed outright. "The heavenly thing is the way you are enjoying it yourself. I never saw a girl light up a whole room before. You throw out stars as you dance." "That's like a skyrocket," Robin laughed back, "and it's because in all my life I never went to a dance before." "Never? You mean except at children's parties?" "There were no children's parties. This is the first. First. Well, I don't see how that happened, but I am glad it did, because it's been a great thing for me to see you at your first. He sat down on the fountain's edge near her. "I shall not forget it," he said. "I shall remember it as long as I live," said Robin, and she lifted her unsafe eyes again and smiled into his, which made them still more unsafe. Perhaps it was because he was extremely young, perhaps it was because he was immoral, perhaps because he had never held a tight rein on his fleeting emotions. Even the next moment he felt that it was because he was an idiot. But suddenly he found he had let himself go and was kissing the warm velvet of the slim little nape. Had kissed it twice. He had not given himself time to think what would happen as a result, but what did happen was humiliating and ridiculous. One furious splash of the curled hand flung water into his face and eyes and mouth, while Robin tore herself free from him and stood blazing with fury and woe, for it was not only fury he saw. You, she cried, and actually would have swooped to the fountain again if he had not caught her arm. He was furious himself, at himself and at her. "You little fool!" he gasped. "What did you do that for? Even if I was a jackass, there was nothing in it. You're so pretty. You spoiled everything," she flamed. Everything, everything. I've spoiled nothing. I've only been a fool, and it's your own fault for being so pretty. You've spoiled everything in the world. Now, with a desolate, horrible little sob, now I can only go back, back. He had a queer idea that she spoke as if she were Cinderella, and he had made the clock strike 12. Her voice had such absolute grief in it that he involuntarily drew her near. I say, he was really breathless, don't speak like that. I beg pardon. I'll grovel. Don't. Oh, Catherine, come here. This last, because at this difficult moment, from between the banks of hothouse bloom and round the big palms, his sister Catherine suddenly appeared. She immediately stopped short and stared at them both, looking from one to the other. "What is the matter?" she asked in a low voice. "Oh, come and talk to her," George broke forth. "I feel as if she might scream in a minute and call everybody in. I've been a lunatic, and she has apparently never been kissed before. Tell her you've been kissed yourself." A queer little look revealed itself in Catherine's face. A delicate vein of her grandmother's wisdom made part of her outlook upon a rapidly moving and exciting world. She had never been hidebound or dull, and for a slight, gauzy white and silver thing, she was astute. "Don't be impudent," she said to George, as she walked up to Robin and put a cool hand on her arm. "He's only being silly. You'd better let him off," she said. She turned a glance on George, who was wiping his sleeve with a handkerchief, and she broke into a small laugh. "Did she push you into the fountain?" she asked cheerfully. "She threw the fountain at me," grumbled George. "I shall have to dash off home and change." "I would," replied Catherine, still cheerful. "You can apologize better when you're dry." He slid through the palms like a snake, and the two girls stood and gazed at each other. Robin's flame had died down, and her face had settled itself into a sort of hardness. Catherine did not know that she herself looked at her as the Duchess might have looked at another girl in the quite different days of her youth. "I'll tell you something now he's gone," she said. "I have been kissed myself, and so have other girls I know. Boys like George don't really matter, though of course it's bad manners. But who has got good manners? Things rush so that there's scarcely time for manners at all. When an older man makes a snatch at you, it's sometimes detestable, but to push him into the fountain was a good idea." And she laughed again. "I didn't push him." "Oh, I wish you had," with a gleeful mischief. The next moment, however, the hint of a worried frown showed itself on her forehead. "You see," she said protestingly, "you are so frightfully pretty." "I'd rather be a leper," Robin shot forth. But Catherine did not, of course, understand. "What nonsense!" she answered. "What utter rubbish! You know you wouldn't. Come back to the ballroom. I came here because my mother was asking for George." She turned to lead the way through the banked flowers, and as she did so, added something. "By the way, somebody important has been assassinated in one of the Balkan countries. They're always assassinating people. They like it. Lord Coombe has just come in, and is talking it over with Grandmamma. I can see they are quite excited in their quiet way." As they neared the entrance to the ballroom, she paused a moment with a new kind of impish smile. "Every girl in the room is absolutely shaky with thrills at this particular moment," she said, "and every man feels himself bristling a little. The very best-looking boy in all England is dancing with Sarah Studley. He dropped in by chance to call, and the Duchess made him stay. He is a kind of miracle of good looks and takingness." Robin said nothing. She had plainly not been interested in the Balkan tragedy, and she as obviously did not care for the miracle. "You don't ask who he is?" said Catherine. "I don't want to know." "Oh, come, you mustn't feel as sulky as that. You'll want to ask questions the moment you see him. I did. Everyone does. His name is Donal Muir. He's Lord Coombe's heir. He'll be the head of the House of Coombe some day. Here he comes," quite excitedly. "Look!" It was one of the tricks of chance, or fate, or whatever you will. The dance brought him within a few feet of them at that very moment, and the slow walking steps he was taking held him. They were some of the queer, stealthy, almost stationary steps of the Argentine tango. He was finely and smoothly fitted, as the other youngsters were, His blond glossed head was set high on a heroic column of neck. He was broad of shoulder, but not too broad, slim of waist, but not too slim, long and strong of leg, but light and supple and firm. He had a fair open brow and a curved mouth laughing to show white teeth. Robin felt he ought to wear a kilt and plaid, and that an eagle's feather ought to be standing up from a chieftain's bonnet on the fair hair, which would have waved if it had been allowed length enough. He was scarcely 2 yards from her now, and suddenly, almost as if he had been called, he turned his eye away from Sarah Studley, who was the little thing in Christmas-tree scarlet. They were blue, like the clear water in a tarn when the sun shines on it, and they were still laughing as his mouth was. Straight into hers they laughed, straight into hers. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of The Head of the House of Coombe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sylviamb. The Head of the House of Coombe by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Through all eons, since all the worlds were made, it is at least not unthinkable that in all the worlds of which our own atom is one, there has ruled a force, illimitable, unconquerable, and inexplicable, and whichsoever its world and whatsoever the sign denoting or the name given it, the force, the thing, has been the same. Upon our own atom of the universe it is given the generic name of love, and its existence is that which the boldest need not defy, the most profound need not attempt to explain with clarity, the most brilliantly sophistical to argue away. Its form of beauty, triviality, magnificence, imbecility, loveliness, stupidity, holiness, purity, and bestiality neither detract from nor add to its unalterable power. As the earth revolves upon its axis, and reveals night and day, spring, summer, and winter, so it reveals this ceaselessly working force. Men who were as gods have been uplifted or broken by it. Fools have trifled with it. Brutes have sullied it. Saints have worshipped. Poets sung, and wits derided it. As electricity is a force death-dealing, or illuminating and power-bestowing, so is this great impeller, and it is fatuous. Howsoever worldly wise or moderately sardonic one would choose to be, to hint ironically that its proportions are less than the ages have proved them. Whether a world formed without a necessity for the presence and assistance of this psychological factor would have been a better or worse one, it is, by good fortune, not here imperative that one should attempt to decide. What is, exists. None of us created it. Each one will deal with the impeller as he himself either sanely or madly elects. He will also bear the consequences, and so also may others. Of this force the head of the House of Coombe and his old friend knew much, and had often spoke to each other. They had both been accustomed to recognizing its signs, subtle or crude, and watching their development. They had seen it in the eyes of creatures young enough to be called boys and girls. They had heard it in musical laughter and in silly giggles. They had seen it express itself in tragedy and comedy, and watched it end in union or in a nothingness which melted away like a wisp of fog. But they knew it was a thing omnipresent, and that no one passed through life untouched by it in some degree. Years before this evening, 2 children playing in a garden had not known that the power, the thing, drew them with its greatest strength, because among myriads of atoms they too were created for oneness. Enraptured and unaware they played together, their souls and bodies drawn nearer each other every hour. So it was that, without being portentous, one may say that when an unusually beautiful and unusually well-dressed and perfectly fitted young man turned involuntarily in the particular London ballroom in which Mrs. Gareth Lawless's daughter watched the dancers, and looked unintentionally into the eyes of a girl standing for a moment near the wide entrance doors, the inexplicable and unconquerable force reconnected its currents again. Donal Muir's eyes only widened a little for a second's time. He had not known why he had suddenly looked around, and he did not know why he was conscious of something which startled him a little. You could not actually stare at a girl because your eyes chanced to get entangled in hers for a second as you danced past her. It was true she was of a startling prettiness, and there was something, yes, there was something which drew the eye, and he did not know what it was. It had actually given him a sort of electric shock. He laughed at himself a little, and then his open brow looked puzzled for a moment. "You saw Miss Lawless," said Sarah Studley, who was at the moment dancing prettily with him. She was guilty of something which might have been called a slight giggle, but it was good-natured. "I know you saw Miss Lawless, the pretty one near the door." "There are so many pretty ones near everything, you can't lift your eyes without seeing one," Donald answered. "What a lot of them!" The sense of having received a slight electric shock made you feel that you must look again and find out what had caused it, he was thinking. "She is the one with the eyelashes." "I have eyelashes. So have you," looking down at hers with a very taking expression. Hers were in fact nice ones. "But ours are not 2 inches long, and they don't make a big soft circle around our eyes when we look at anyone." "Please look up and let me see," said Donal. "When I asked you to dance with me, I thought—" What a way he had, Sarah Studley was thinking. But perhaps it was the eyelashes, was passing through Donal's mind. Very noticeable eyelashes were rather arresting. "I knew you saw her," said Sarah Studley, "because I have happened to be near 2 or 3 people this evening when they caught their first sight of her." "What happens to them?" asked Donal Muir. "They forget where they are," she laughed, "and don't say anything for a few seconds." "I should not want to forget where I am. It wouldn't be possible, either," answered Donal. "But that was it," he thought. "For a minute I forgot." One should not dance with one girl and talk to her about another. Wisely, he led her to other subjects. The music was swinging through the air, performing its everlasting miracle of swinging young souls and pulses with it. The warmed flowers breathed more perceptible scent, sweet chatter and laughter, swaying colour and glowing eyes concentrated in making magic. This beautiful young man's pulses only beat with the rest, as one with the pulse of the universe. Lady Lothwell, acting for the Duchess, was very kind to him, finding him another partner as soon as a new dance began. This time her own daughter, Lady Catherine. Even while he had been tangoing with Sarah Studley, he had seen the girl with the eyelashes, whirling about with someone, and when he began his dance with Catherine, he caught a glimpse of her at the other end of the room, and almost immediately Catherine spoke of her. "I don't know when you will get a dance with Miss Lawless," she said. "She is obliged to work out mathematical problems on her program." "I have a setter who fixes his eyes on you and waits without moving until you look at him, and then he makes a dart and you're obliged to pat him," he said. "Perhaps if I go and stand near her and do that, she will take notice of me." Take notice of him, the enslaving thing, thought Catherine. She'd jump for all her talk about lepers. Any girl would. He's too nice. There's something about him, too. Robin did not jump. She had no time to do it, because one dance followed another so quickly, and some of them were even divided in 2 or 3 pieces. But the thrill of the singing sound of the violins behind the greenery, the perfume and stately spaces and 1,000 candlelights had suddenly been lifted on to another plane, though she had thought they could reach no higher one. Her whole being was a keen, fine awareness. Every moment she was aware, after all the years, from the faraway days, he had come back. No one had dreamed of the queer, half-abnormal secret she had always kept to herself as a child, as a little girl, and as a bigger one when she would have died rather than divulge that in her loneliness there had been something she had remembered, something she had held on to, a memory which she had actually made a companion of, making pictures, telling herself stories in the dark, even inventing conversations which not for one moment had she thought would or could ever take place. But they had been living things to her, and her one near warm comfort, closer, oh, so weirdly closer than kind Dowie, and dearly beloved Mademoiselle. She had wondered if the two would have disapproved if they had known, if Mademoiselle would have been shocked if she had realized that sometimes when they walked together, there walked with them a growing, laughing boy in a swinging kilt and plaid, and that he had a voice and eyes that drew the heart out of your breast for joy. At first he had only been a child like herself, but as she had grown, he had grown with her, but always taller, grander, marvelously masculine and beyond compare. Yet never once had she dared to believe or hope that he could take form before her eyes, a living thing. He had only been the shadow she had loved, and which could not be taken away from her because he was her secret, and no one could ever know. The music went swinging and singing with notes which were almost a pain, and he was in the very room with her. Donal! Donal! He had not known and did not know. He had laughed into her eyes without knowing, but he had come back, a young man now like all the rest, but more beautiful. What a laugh! What wonderful shoulders! What wonderful dancing! How long and strongly smooth and supple he was in the fine fabric of his clothes! Though her mind did not form these things in words for her, it was only that her eyes saw all the charm of him from head to foot, and told her that he was only more than ever what he had been in the miraculous first days. Perhaps he will not find out at all, she thought, dancing all the while and trying to talk as well as to think. I was too little for him to remember. I only remembered because I had nothing else. Oh, if he should not find out! She could not go and tell him. Even if a girl could do such a thing, perhaps he could not recall a childish incident of so long ago. Such a small thing. It had only been immense to her, and so much water had flowed under his bridge, bearing so many flotillas. She had only stood and looked down at a thin, trickling stream which carried no ships at all. It was very difficult to keep her eyes from stealing, even darting about in search of him. His high, fair head, with the clipped wave in its hair, could be followed if one dared to be alert. He danced with an auburn-haired girl. He spun down the room with a brown one. He paused for a moment to show the trick of a new step to a tall one with black coils. He was at the end of the room. He was tangoing towards her, and she felt her heart beat and beat. He passed close by, and his eyes turned upon her, and after he had passed, a queer little inner trembling would not cease. Oh, if he had looked a little longer! If her partner would only carry her past him! And how dreadful she was to let herself feel so excited when he could not be expected to remember such a little thing. Just a baby playing with him in the garden. Oh, her heart giving a leap if he would look! If he would look! When did she first awaken to a realization, after what seemed years and years of waiting and not being able to conquer the inwardly trembling feeling, that he was beginning to look, that somehow he had become aware of her presence, and that it drew his eyes, though there was no special recognition in them? Down the full length of the room they met hers first, and again as he passed with yet another partner. Then, when he was resting between dances, and being very gay indeed, though somehow he always seemed gay. He had been gay when they played in the gardens. Yes, his eyes came and found her. She thought he spoke of her to someone near him. Of course Robin looked away and tried not to look again too soon. But when, in spite of intention and even determination, something forced her glance and made it a creeping, following glance, there were his eyes again. She was frightened each time it happened, but he was not. She began to know with new beatings of the pulse that he no longer looked by chance, but because he wanted to see her, and wished her to see him, as if he had begun to call to her with a gay Donal challenge. It was like that, though his demeanour was faultlessly correct. The incident of their meeting was faultlessly correct also, when after one of those endless lapses of time Lady Lothwell appeared and presented him as if the brief ceremony were one of the most ordinary in existence. The conventional grace of his bow said no more than George's had said to those looking on. But when he put his arm round her and they began to sway together in the dance, Robin wondered in terror if he could not feel the beating of her heart under his hand. If he could, it would be horrible, but it would not stop. To be so near, to try to believe it, to try to make herself remember that she could mean nothing to him, and that it was only she who was shaking, for nothing. But she could not help it. This was the disjointed kind of thing that flew past her mental vision. She was not a shy girl, but she could not speak. Curiously enough, he also was quite silent for several moments. They danced for a space without a word, and they did not notice that people began to watch them because they were an attracting pair to watch. And the truth was that neither of the two knew in the least what the other thought. "That is a beautiful waltz," he said at last. He said it in a low, meaning voice, as if it were a sort of emotional confidence. He had not actually meant to speak in such a tone, but when he realized what its sound had been, he did not care in the least. What was the matter with him? "Yes," Robin answered. Only yes. He had not known when he glanced at her first. He was saying mentally, he could not, of course, swear to her now, but what an extraordinary thing! She was like a swallow. She was like any swift flying thing on a man's arm. One could go on to the end of time. Once round the great ballroom, twice, and as the third round began he gave a little laugh and spoke again. "I'm going to ask you a question. May I?" "Yes." "Is your name Robin?" "Yes." She could scarcely breathe it. "I thought it was," in the voice in which he had spoken of the music. "I hoped it was. After I first began to suspect, I hoped it was." "It is. It is." "Did we—" He had not indeed meant that his arm should hold her a shade closer, but in spite of himself it did, because he was, after all, so little more than a boy. "Did we play together in a garden?" "Yes, yes," breathed Robin. "We did." Surely she heard a sound as if he had caught a quick breath, but after it there were a few more steps, and another brief space of silence. "I knew," he said next, very low, "I knew that we played together in a garden." "You did not know when you first looked at me tonight," innocently revealing that even his first glance had been no casual thing to her. But his answer revealed something too. "You were near the door. Just coming into the room, I didn't know why you startled me. I kept looking for you afterwards in the crowd." "I didn't see you look," said Robin softly, revealing still more in her utter inexperience. "No, because you wouldn't look at me. You were too much engaged. Do you like this step?" "I like them all." "Do you always dance like this? Do you always make your partner feel as if he danced with you all his life?" "It is because we played together in the garden," said Robin, and then was quite terrified at herself, because after all, they were only two conventional young people meeting for the first time at a dance, not knowing each other in the least. It was really the first time. The meeting of two children could not count, but the beating and strange elated inward tremor would not stop. As for himself, he felt abnormal also, and he was usually a very normal creature. It was abnormal to be so excited that he found himself, as it were, upon another plane, because he had recognized and was dancing with a girl he had not seen since she was 5 or 6. It was not normal that he should be possessed by a desire to keep near to her, overwhelmed by an impelling wish to talk to her, to ask her questions. About what? About herself, themselves, the years between, about the garden. It began to come back bit by bit after I had 2 fair looks. You passed me several times, though you didn't know. Oh, had she not known? I had been promised some dances by other people, but I went to Lady Lothwell. She's very kind. Back swept the years, and it had all begun again, the wonderful happiness, just as the anguish had swept back on the night her mother had come to talk to her. As he had brought it into her dreary little world, then he brought it now. He had the power. She was so happy that she seemed to be only waiting to hear what he would say, as if that were enough. There are phases like this, rare ones, and it was her fate that through such a phase she was passing. It was indeed true that much more water had passed under his bridge than under hers, but now memory reproduced for him with an acuteness like actual pain, a childish torment he thought he had forgotten. and it was as if it had been endured only yesterday, and as if the urge to speak and explain was as intense as it had been on the first day. "She's very little, she won't understand," it said to his mother. "She's very little, really. Perhaps she'll cry." How monstrous it had seemed. Had she cried? Poor little soul. He looked down at her eyelashes. Her cheek had been of the same color and texture then. That came back to him, too. The impulse to tighten his arms was infernally powerful, almost automatic. "She has no one but me to remember," he heard his own child voice saying fiercely. Good Lord, it was as if it had been yesterday. He actually gulped something down in his throat. "You haven't rested much," he said aloud. "There's a conservatory with marble seats and corners and a fountain going. Will you let me take you there when we stop dancing? I want to apologize to you." The eyelashes lifted themselves and made round her eyes the big soft shadow of which Sarah Studley had spoken. A strong and healthy valvular organ in his breast lifted itself curiously at the same time. To apologize? Was he speaking to her almost as if she were still 4 or 5? It was to the helplessness of those years he was about to explain, and yet he did not feel as though he were still 8. "I want to tell you why I never came back to the garden. It was a broken promise, wasn't it? The music had not ceased, but they stopped dancing." "Will you come?" he said, and she went with him like a child, just as she had followed in her babyhood. It seemed only natural to do what he asked. The conservatory was like an inner paradise now. The tropically scented warmth, the tiers on tiers of bloom above bloom, the softened swing of music, the splash of the fountain on waters and leaves. Their plane had lifted itself too. They could hear the splashing water and sometimes feel it in the corner seat of the marble he took her to. A crystal drop fell on her hand when she sat down. The blue of his eyes was vaguely troubled, and he spoke as if he were not certain of himself. "I was wakened up in what seemed to me the middle of the night," he said, as if indeed the thing had happened only the day before. "My mother was obliged to go back suddenly to Scotland. I was only a little chap, but it nearly finished me. Parents and guardians don't understand how gigantic such a thing can be. I had promised you. We had promised each other, hadn't we?" "Yes," said Robin. Her eyes were fixed upon his face, open and unmoving. Such eyes! Such eyes! All of the touchingness of the past was in their waiting on his words. Children, little boys especially, are taught that they must not cry out when they are hurt. As I sat in the train through the journey that day, I thought my heart would burst in my small breast. I turned my back and stared out of the window for fear my mother would see my face. I'd always loved her. Do you know, I think that just then I hated her. I had never hated anything before. Good Lord, what a thing for a little chap to go through! My mother was an angel, but she didn't know." "No," said Robin, in a small, strange voice, and without moving her gaze. "She didn't know." He had seated himself on a sort of low marble stool near her, and he held a knee with clasped hands. They were hands which held each other for the moment with a sort of emotional clinch. His position made him look upward at her instead of down. "It was you I was wild about," he said. "You see, it was you. I could have stood it for myself. The trouble was that I felt I was such a big little chap. I thought I was years, ages older than you, and mountains bigger." His faint laugh was touched with pity for the smallness of the big little chap. "You seemed so tiny and pretty and lonely." "I was as lonely as a newborn bird fallen out of its nest." "You had told me you had nothing. You said no one had ever kissed you. I'd been loved all my life. You had a wandering way of fixing your eyes on me as if I could give you everything. Perhaps it was a coxy little chap's conceit that made me love you for it, but perhaps it wasn't. You were everything," Robin said. And the mere simpleness of the way in which she said it brought the garden so near that he smelt the warm hawthorn and heard the distant piano organ, and it quickened his breath. "It was because I kept seeing your eyes and hearing your laugh that I thought my heart was bursting. I knew you'd go and wait for me, and gradually your little face would begin to look different. I knew you'd believe I'd come. She's little, that was what I kept saying to myself again and again, and she'll cry awfully, and she'll think I did it. She'll never know. There," he hesitated a moment, "there was a kind of mad shame in it, as if I'd betrayed your littleness and your belief, though I was too young to know what betraying was." Just as she had looked at him before, as if he could give her everything, she was looking at him now. In what other way could she look while he gave her this wonderful soothing, binding softly all the old wounds with unconscious, natural touch, because he had really been all her child's being had been irradiated and warmed by. There was no pose in his manner, no sentimental or flirtatious youth's affecting of a picturesque attitude. It was real, and he told her this thing because he must for his own relief. "Did you cry?" he said. "Did my little chap's conceit make too much of it? I suppose I ought to hope it did." Robin put her hand softly against her heart. "No," she answered. "I was only a baby, but I think it killed something here." He caught a big, hard breath. "Oh," he said, and for a few seconds simply sat and gazed at her. "But it came to life again?" he said afterwards. "I don't know. I don't know what it was. Perhaps it could only live in a very little creature, but it was killed." "I say," broke from him, "it was like wringing a canary's neck when it was singing in the sun." A sudden swelling of the music of a new dance swept into them, and he rose and stood up before her. "Thank you for giving me my chance to tell you," he said. This was the apology. "You have been kind to listen." "I wanted to listen," Robin said. "I'm glad I didn't live a long time and grow old and die without your telling me. When I saw you tonight I almost said aloud, 'He's come back.'" "I'm glad I came. It's queer how one can live a thing over again. There have been all the years between for us both. For me there's been all a lad's life, tutors and Eton and Oxford and people and lots of travel and amusement. But the minute I set eyes on you near the door something must have begun to drag me back. I'll own I've never liked to let myself dwell on that memory. It wasn't a good thing, because it had a trick of taking me back in a fiendish way to the little chap with his heart bursting in the railway carriage, and the betrayal feeling. It's morbid to let yourself grouse over what can't be undone. So you faded away, but when I danced past you, somehow I knew I'd come on something. It made me restless. I couldn't keep my eyes away decently. Then all at once I knew. I couldn't tell you what the effect was. There you were again. I was as much obliged to tell you as I should have been if I'd found you at Braemarnie when I got there that night. Conventions had nothing to do with it. It would not have mattered even if you'd obviously thought I was a fool. You might have thought so, you know." "No, I mightn't," answered Robin. "There have been no Eton and Oxford and amusements for me. This is my first party." She rose as he had done, and they stood for a second or so with their eyes resting on each other's, each with a young smile quivering into life which neither was conscious of. It was she who first wakened and came back. He saw a tiny pulse flutter in her throat, and she lifted her hand with a delicate gesture. "This dance was Lord Halwyn's, and we've sat it out. We must go back into the ballroom." "I suppose we must," he answered with slow reluctance, but he could scarcely drag his eyes away from hers, even though he obeyed, and they turned and went. In the shining ballroom the music rose and fell and swelled again into ecstasy as he took her white young likeness in his arm, and they swayed and darted and swooped like things of the air, while the old Duchess and Lord Coombe looked on, almost unseen, and talked in murmurs of Sarajevo. The end of the head of the House of Coombe.